Okay. Committee will come to order. Do you need to take roll, or are we fine on that?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Yes,
So
which?
Senator Brightman,
Here.
Senator Brennan,
Here.
Senator Rothfuss, Senator Steinmetz,
Here.
Representative Allred,
Here.
Representative Andrew,
Here.
Representative Berger,
Here.
Representative Brown is excused, Representative Claston,
Here.
Representative Lawley,
Here.
Representative Obermueller,
Here.
Representative Provenza,
Here.
Co-Chairman Northrup,
Here.
Chairman Scott.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay. Committee, what we're going to do, we didn't finish last night, the Education Savings Account Bill 0052. We did complete the public testimony. I do not anticipate taking any more testimony on the bill. So we're ready to work the bill. Do I hear a motion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I move 24 LSO 52 working draft 0.6.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Committee, any amendments? Senator Brightman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment. Yesterday, I passed out this year's clean bill, which was Senate File 143 engrossed, Wyoming Freedom Scholarships Act 2. I would like to move this as an amendment, as a substitute bill. And if I get a second, I'll explain. Okay.
Okay, moved and seconded. And it does appear to be germane, and we do have the full text of it.
Correct. So, Mr.
We did
Chairman.
see it session.
We did. This is the engrossed version that passed the Senate, so it did get, we worked it in the Senate Education Committee, and we worked it 3 readings on the Senate floor, and it passed the Senate and ended up over in the Speaker's drawer. The reason why I'm bringing this, Mr. Chairman, this is the clean version. This is what the people wanted to begin with. This is where we should have been starting from. This is the real school choice bill. What this does, I'll walk you through some of the key points. You'll see that it's structured pretty much the same as the current bill draft that we're working from. This would strip out the pre-K portion, which was never contemplated by the original bill, and it's pre-K is not currently funded by the state. It cuts out all the red tape associated with the housing of the duties in this office of the state superintendent. It restores protection for homeschoolers. If you flip to page 11, we heard yesterday some testimony from the homeschoolers that were concerned that they weren't necessarily sure what this bill did to them. So the original bill had protection in there for them. It's at the bottom of page 11, at the end of line 21, 22, and then over to page 12, lines 1 and 2. Restores religious freedom language on page 9, lines 19 through 21, if you're working off the engrossed bill. That's where you'll find that. That was taken out of this bill, and then it's not in the current bill. It also would restore funding to all students. We heard from parents yesterday that want the money to follow the backpacks. No matter where you are at in life, financially, it takes out all the references to the poverty level and opens it up to all students. We heard testimony in the morning about children with learning disabilities and the struggles those parents had to get help for their kids, where their school they were at by zip code was failing them. And they had to spend thousands of dollars of their own money to fix the problem. And sometimes it didn't get fixed. All parents should have the right to dictate and direct their child's education as they see fit, whether it's the local public school or whether it's a private school, homeschool, whatever they decide, that should be their right. Restores funding level back to the $6,000 per student, which is where we started from. We heard yesterday that $6,000 might not even be enough, but it's a better start than where we're at now, Mr. Chairman. It's a $30 million appropriation versus the $40 million appropriation in the current bill. Eliminates 2 full-time employees from the current draft and the $400,000 appropriation to pay for those full-time employees. It also eliminates the $400,000 appropriation for the 900 series contract for services. And Mr. Chairman, this is the bill that the people of Wyoming want. This is what my constituents want. I have to deliver for my constituents just like everybody else does. And let's listen to the people we work for a change, and not the special interest lobbyists. So let's get to work.
So essentially, what this amendment does is it puts in a similar but earlier version of the education savings account for the traditional public schools. And you've explained the differences between them. This would eliminate the preschool provisions in the bill that was before us yesterday. And if passing this motion does not pass the preschool, but if this motion should pass, I will then entertain a motion to do the preschool portions as a separate bill. And that would then stand on its own. Okay, committee discussion. Senator Ruffus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and against the motion, and for a few reasons. I moved the original bill draft based on the early childhood education, which is something that this committee has been trying to find a way to provide funding for the entire time that I've been in the legislature. And quite honestly, I'm not enthused about the other half of the bill on ESAs for K-12 education, but I think overall, on balance, the bill that we're considering as the original draft becomes a positive for the people of the state of Wyoming, particularly those that are low income, those that we have the constitutional ability to provide additional funding for. And so it's going to provide a more robust education system overall because of the early childhood component. So when we now compare that with the proposed amendment, which was the bill draft that was considered in the Senate last year, came through our committee, so I remember the legislation well. The objections I had last year about the constitutionality of the legislation, about the cost, about taking away from our K-12 education system, and undermining the integrity of the K-12 education system all stand. So in my view, the original bill draft that we have before us, the K-12 ESAs are questionable from a constitutional standpoint. There might be challenges, but there are ties to constitutionality based on the income testing of 250% of federal poverty level might be sufficient for a court to be comfortable with that being appropriate for the state. I don't see any way that the alternative amendment bill draft that we have proposed by Senator Beitman would pass any constitutional scrutiny. So from my perspective, it would be a defeat of the bill overall, whether by the legislature or by the court. So if we pass this motion for the amendment, there's no bill effectively in the long run, whether that's through the same fate that it met last year, or whether that's through the fate of the courts in the long run. I don't think it helps education in any way. So I would encourage the committee, if you want anything to move forward and to be effective and to end up passing, to provide some level of support for those that are in need in the state. The original bill draft that we're contemplating is the right bill draft. The alternative proposed amendment would be unlikely to affect positively anyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would remind the body that this overwhelmingly passed the Senate last year, and so I do believe it has a good opportunity, especially with the indication that the Speaker of the House is much more favorable to school choice this year, as he indicated yesterday. By separating these two issues, I think we do a better service to the state of Wyoming and to our citizens, because as I look at our agenda today, we have funding issues with our CDCs already, and it would behoove us to take care of the programs we have in place before we start adding additional programs. The testimony I heard yesterday is inadequate for me to make a decision on the preschools, the universal preschools, because we don't have adequate information. We don't know numbers, we don't know costs, we don't know, I mean, as we see our budget ballooning and people's wallets affected by the fuel prices and inflation at the grocery store and food costs and property taxes, adding another program when we can't fund the ones we currently have for some of the most vulnerable people in our society, our children with disabilities at preschool level. For me, I just can't make that kind of a choice today on expanding universal preschool until we have that discussion with our CDCs. And so for those reasons, I'm in strong support of this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would challenge that this passed the Senate overwhelmingly. It was a 17-14 vote on third reading, which is not going to meet 2/3 threshold. And procedurally, you know, I know we do substitute bills, but I struggle with bringing the substitute bill when on the House side, we didn't get to hear the testimony. And part of the issue that I have with that is that during our House discussion during the last session, we had a room full of people talking about early childhood education, talking about how they are in desperate need for childcare. And so I think we heard different testimony, impassioned on what side of this bill that would be eliminated in this draft. And so from the House perspective, I would have liked to have, you know, I think maybe we would have heard a different group of folks if they knew that we were going to gut childhood education, early childhood education from this bill draft, because I think a lot of people desperately need this. And it, you know, and to some of the other points made about we don't know how the early childhood education portion of this is going to go. I'm not advocating one way or another at this point, but I will say we also don't know how the ESA portion of this bill is going to go. We really don't. We don't know if it's even going to pass constitutional muster, let alone how that program is going to be implemented. And I think, you know, we'll talk more about that as we move forward in discussing the bill draft before us, aside from this amendment. But there's a lot of questions on all of it. But I think kind of at the 11th hour of the interim, this is what we're doing, is bad practice for an interim meeting.
I just want to speak a minute to the early childhood and the statement that this bill contemplates universal pre-K programming. In fact, it doesn't do that. It incentivizes parents to get preschool education for their children so they're prepared for kindergarten. So that's totally different. In fact, I don't support the idea of some sort of government-built pre-K program at this time. That I would rather use a vehicle like this to incentivize that. And particularly in areas we know from testimony, again, we heard during our session about some of the areas where it's most needed in low-income area where those kids need the most help. So that is not universal preschool. This is not what this is. It's providing an opportunity to incentivize the education of preschool kiddos to be ready for kindergarten. So I just wanted to clarify that. That's not really what this bill does. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good discussion. I guess, you know, where I come from on this, obviously the substitute bill thing happens in the House, evidently. It's a thing. But, you know, this is what we voted on for an interim topic, was based on Representative Andrews' bill. And this is that bill. What we got was something completely different, forced upon us. And I voiced my frustration about it a few times at previous meetings during the interim, that's not what we voted on as an interim topic. So this gets us back to starting with that bill and that idea. And I don't think that's completely out of left field. I think that's where we should have started this whole process. You know, I find it pretty revealing that, you know, the bill will die if the pre-K portion comes out. Is that what this is really about, is getting the pre-K? Because I've been in the legislature long enough to learn where you start and where you finish. You start at your position of strength and you always end up with something less than what you wanted. If we start out with a crap sandwich, Mr. Chairman, we're going to end up with a crap sandwich without the bread. So that's just where it's going to end up. I know it. And I just don't see this thing ending up any better than it is. It's going to probably end up worse than it is by the time it gets through both chambers. And I can't support that. I can support real education choice, but I can't support a watered down bill that puts things in there that wouldn't pass on their own. I don't think that pre-K stuff would pass on its own. That's why it's inserted in here. That's kind of Washington, D.C. style politics, where you put something in a bill that is very popular among the people, that the people want passed, and you put something bad in there that wouldn't pass on its own. And that's what's happening here. So that's my objection. That's why I'm offering this amendment. And I ask for an aye vote. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the problem I have with entertaining this amendment at this time is it opens up the whole debate over what it means to have the money follow the child. That's there's a lot of nuances to that in terms of how the school funding model works, the disparity in the funding of kids around the state. And so the idea that there is some pot of money that you take and divide up equally so that the money follows the child is something that really needs to be vetted, thought about, and talked about. So, and we haven't taken that testimony on this bill, so I don't think that this amendment is ready to be ready for an aye vote, simply because we haven't taken the testimony on how that would actually work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. First of all, I'd like to know where the money's coming from. The other bill had it coming out of general fund. If this money is coming out of the educational funds, then I'm against that. Also against it because it doesn't have preschool in it. I think that the preschools are very important for kids. My kids, we put them through preschool ourselves, and there are very, very many people who do not have the ability to do that, and I'd like to see them have a chance to get their kids into some kind of preschool for a period of time. So, but please tell me where the money's coming from.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just being pretty familiar with this amendment as the original sponsor of the original bill, the money for this draft comes from federal mineral royalties, which are not specifically designated for any purpose. They are a source of funding that feeds into school funds, but they are they're taken before they become school funds.
About this, and I will say I'm a supporter of both halves of the original bill, and would vote that way. The question is, should we split this, in my way of thinking, should we split this into two bills or keep it as one bill? I do think the way the money is financed, we are arguably within the Constitution, because the prohibitions do apply if we use education funds, are pretty clear. But the federal mineral royalties are and the general fund in the original bill. Neither one of those are specified as they're not education funds at the time they're taken. So we'll see how the courts will rule on that, and I don't care to predict that. In some ways, sometimes you put things together, they are related. We don't have a constitutional problem with two subjects in the same bill with the original. It's a matter of our judgment as to what's the best way to proceed. The preschool stuff in the original bill, I thought was a fairly creative approach to getting it and using the same kind of principles as we were using in the K-12 educational savings account. And that has some virtue. You might help pass both of them. On the other hand, you may pick up the enemies of each one, combine them and not be able to pass anything. And that's a matter of judgment as to which way we go. I think reasonable person can go either way, and you're going to have to make up your mind. There is a weakness in the pre-K bill when you trace it through, and I had trouble with it last night and was looking in the original bill on page 10, starting at line 2, there's a provision for students eligible for the ESA, and when you look at the reference, the AI of this section, that's the K-12 part of it. There is no, they list what they're going to do, require student to receive instruction, reading, writing, mathematics, etc. There is no comparable provision on the preschool portion. When you trace through the definitions, apparently a qualified school can be a preschool, but it doesn't really say what a preschool is that I can find. So that's a problem, that's a fixable problem in session, but it is a problem, a weakness in the original bill we were looking at here. And I'm not quite clear how that, if you split them up, doesn't really change that weakness. It's a problem in both. I'd say to the committee, you've got a choice. It may well be that these will proceed better as separate bills. The version that's proposed to be inserted does not have the means test in it that the bill that we were considering yesterday has. My judgment is that means test is a useful means for the K-12 program of limiting the expenditures, but there isn't a 16.6 problem in K-12 education. We have never felt, and I don't think courts have ever ruled, that Article 16, Section 6 applies to K-12 education because it's separately authorized very clearly in Article 7. It may be essential for the preschool part constitutionally, so that you don't violate Section 16.6. Just the way Article 7 is written, it starts at basically at age 6. So that's an issue to consider. You are losing that degree of control when you get rid of that on the expenditures. So it's a balance. I'm going to vote aye. I'm going to vote aye on the two parts separately or together. But you've got a judgment to make as to what's the best way to proceed. And I would urge us, if we have further debate, we've got to keep it civil and clean, because we've got a reasonable set of alternatives before us. Anything further? Okay, the question is, shall the amendment that puts the substitute bill in pass? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Show of hands. All those in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Motion fails. Any further motions on the bill? Any further amendments? Senator Brennan.
I would propose that we take and split this into two bills, making the pre-K 1 bill and the K through 12 a separate bill.
That is essentially I think we just voted that down. I don't see, I think we've decided that issue.
Mr. Chairman? Not necessarily, because the current version of the bill is substantially different now that we're back on that bill than what I was proposing going back to the clean bill.
Okay.
So there's nuances in how it's funded, all these different things, and if we're going to work that bill, I see where Senator Brennan's going with this, and I think that is appropriate, and I would support that motion. So if she's looking for a second, I'll second that.
Okay, do we have a second? Do we have a second?
Whiteman seconded.
Well, okay,
Yeah, he was seconding, not me.
okay, Senator Ralphus.
Mr. Chairman, I think the concern there, and I understand the interest in that, this is the third and final meeting of the Education Committee. Breaking this into two bills at this point in time, even if I wanted to do that, and I certainly personally support one half of this and don't support the other half of it. It would make a clean vote for me. But it's not as simple as just take the first half of the bill and then take the second half of the bill. It's a complicated separation to create two new bills, and we will not see those two bills separately. We won't know how the funding works separately. There's not enough detail to support in a third meeting, final meeting, where we have Education Committee sponsorship as the end result of it, this motion. So I would discourage support for the motion, even though it certainly makes my vote a lot easier if they're two separate bills at the end.
Okay, further discussion? Senator Brightman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in response to that, I get that too, and but here we are. We didn't get to work this bill at the last meeting. This is the first time we're working it. I'd be okay coming back for half a day to work some more, because we got hired to do the job. Let's do the job. I'm not afraid to roll up my sleeves and get to work. So to get this right, but yeah, I understand that this is the third reading, but this is our first chance, or third meeting, but this is our first chance to work the bill as a committee. So let's work the bill.
Further discussion? Everybody understand the motion? All those in favor, we're going to do it show of hands to start with. All those in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4. Representative Lawley, are you?
I did, I had it up, I'm sorry.
I get 7 against, 5 in favor, same as before. Okay, that's failed. Anything further on the bill? Anything further?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm not advocating for the state treasurer's office, but yesterday you took testimony from the state treasurer's office. Someone may be interested in forwarding those amendments.
Yes, I'm aware of that. There's some reasons not to do them too, but if somebody wants to.
I will make that motion to implement the 3 or 4 amendments, basically removing state treasurer and making the payment authority, the Wyoming Department of Education, consistent with the request by the treasurer's office.
Okay. Moved and seconded. Further discussion? Further discussion? Let me say, I have some reservations about those amendments. I think that by shifting it to the Education Department, which is, I understand what the amendment does, you're giving credence to an argument that we're really spending education funds. And I think that using the treasurer's office was an attempt to make it clear that that's not the case. So I think that's why it was done that way. Now, it's a matter of judgment. Does it really make any difference or not? But I think that's the argument against doing it.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's probably the justification for it and a reasonable argument. What I would say is that the department already does distribute other funds that are not school foundation program funds, and I think there's a long history of an understanding that they have school foundation program fund distribution, and then they have non-school foundation program. They were also the agent that provided funding for some early childhood education grants that came through this committee 10 years ago at one point. So I think there's a substantial precedent for them not just having them be school funds. I think it is cleaner to the extent that it just requires a double work from a bureaucracy standpoint. The motion diminishes the total amount of government that is required.
Okay. You've heard the motion. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Show of hands. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, I get 7 again. Opposed? 7 to 5, okay. Motion carried. Anything further? Representative Law.
On page 10, lines 9 through 11, be amended to strike the word requires that, a capital to the T, so we're section B on 9 and 10. Strike requires that, and then a capitalization of the word the ESA student, and then insert the word may take either, strike the word the, or a statewide assessment, take off the S of assessment, and then strike administered pursuant to WS 21-2304A and the colon or semicolon there, and then insert or a nationally normed referenced achievement exam, semicolon. And I have a conforming amendment on page 20. So I like to do them together, but on page 20 of the bill, I'm going to turn over there and look at line 19. And what my amendment is to insert after the word students on line 19, who choose to participate, actually participate's already there, who choose to. So insert the phrase who choose to, and it will say participate in the statewide assessment.
Okay, 19, which line?
19, it's page 20, line 19.
Page 20, line 19.
Sorry. So we're just inserting who choose to after the word students. It's just conforming because we're no longer requiring the statewide assessments. People can choose it as an option, but that just conforms
so
that. And if I get a second, I'd like to speak to the amendment.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. One of the reasons that I feel like this amendment is really important is, one of the things about this bill that I felt does have some constitutional concerns is can be a tendency to over-regulate choice. And let me just walk you kind of through how that happens and why we have to do a balancing. The state, there's an interest of the state to do some amount of regulations. They have that right, but there's also the parental right to direct the education of their students and to have the choice. So the state's right to regulate is not unhindered, it's not limited. So under the United States Constitution, parents have a fundamental right to direct the education of their children, and it's recognized, as I said yesterday, as a liberty issue under the 14th Amendment, and that is well settled, and U.S. Supreme Court has that well settled. So, but it's also settled that states have the ability to establish and regulate private schools. They can regulate private schools to some degree. So we're talking about a balancing act here, and there's been some cases, mostly at the state level, interpreting the U.S. constitutional provisions under the 14th Amendment and the right of parents to sort of what does that look like? And in my view, having the superintendent approve and then on the back end only state assessments is excessive regulation. It's in effect saying that private education has to be a certain way that models the state education. And most of the reasons that parents would choose private education is because there's something they have found lacking or something their child needs that isn't in the public system. So there's a particular case in 1976 out of the Ohio Supreme Court where they applied the minimum standards test, because that's kind of the test the Supreme Court has, is that you basically have to have minimum standards. So think of it as like the least restrictive environment type idea, that they can have some standards, but if they go too far, then they are really in effect depriving parents of any choice in education. And I think the testing requirements only according to state standards does that. And so I believe we need to take it out, and we need to open up the testing part of this to some other nationally normed options for the state to use. And so that's the reason I strongly encourage you to support the amendment.
Okay. I will observe there's an illiteracy in the mesh between the lead-in in on lines 2 and 3, and then the language at the start of each of the subparagraphs, and your amendment does correct that for this subparagraph. Not just a drafting problem. I saw several hands over here. Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm less concerned about legality or constitutionality of this more so than I am the concern of taxpayers. I get, this balancing act with private schools and regulation. That's all fine and well. But what this is doing is not, when you make the decision, when the state makes a decision, you're going to get public money. That my tax dollars and my constituents' tax dollars are going to be used to then go pay for your private school. That balancing act then has to shift a little bit, right? Because it's now public money, government money that has to be spent. And I want to know is, this is a measure of accountability. Is that money worth it? And I think when we remove this testing standard, we are pulling away from being able to say, is government money being well spent? Because now we're going to have less of a way to say if it's worth it. I mean, hopefully we do this and we see great outcomes. I'm not convinced of that, Mr. Chairman. But aside from just the legal issues of it, not with this amendment, we're not regulating choice, we're regulating accountability of our state funds. And when we don't measure that, there is not an accountability mechanism.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do just have a question about the amendment structure and how the language was changed. Taking out requires that the And I understand that when you only read the immediate Romanet 2 and don't take it back into the previous paragraph, that might seem to conform, but the requires that the does conform when you go back to the original opening paragraph and then read it in as it stacks up through the structure. So my question is, was that removal of requires that a desire to make testing overall optional, or was it to conform the language? And then my same question relates to, I believe the language may instead of shall was used, which means that everything becomes optional after the may. It doesn't become a choice of two things. It is a choice of those two things or nothing, which would leave off testing. And then I would certainly have the concern that Representative Provenza was saying, that there is at that point no accountability. So I'm trying to understand the structure of how that language was proposed and what the intent was of that proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, the intent is that they may take one or the other assessment. And assessments, there's optional assessments. And so that's the intent. And to go back to Representative Provenza's points, I want to point out a couple things. First of all, there's a presumption here, I believe in your argument, that nationally normed referenced achievement exams are insufficient, that they're inadequate to test and to provide the information needed. And I don't think there's any evidence of that. In fact, we heard testimony from others yesterday that those were appropriate measures and more appropriate than the state assessments because they're tied to a certain approach to education. And some parents want a choice to a different type of education, for example, classical education, that wouldn't be, that the state standard, the state testing would not necessarily be testing for what the parent has chosen as the direction they want for the education of their child. So that's the idea of open up the testing. The idea of accountability is built into the use of this kind of testing, doing testing at all. So we can work on the language. It's not trying to say you don't have to have testing. It's basically giving them options on the type of testing that the student take. There's also another element of accountability here that I think is important to see in balancing the idea of accountability and striking the balance that the Supreme Court, I think, has in mind here, is the idea that the superintendent under this bill of public instruction has a process of approving providers. And so that creates some level of accountability as well. So it's not just testing accountability. There's other accountability in this bill. But in effect, if you tie everything to the state testing, which is tested towards a certain approach and philosophy concerning education, and that's the requirement to test the appropriateness of, or the effectiveness of, a different type of an educational system, it's not a match, really, in my view. And so I believe that you have to open it up to something that's broader, and that's what these nationally normed tests do. And because you can end up just telling parents that if your child can't pass the education as we structure it in Wyoming sort of standards, then you can't have any other education. And that's what the Supreme Court's talking about in saying over-regulating to the point you've taken away the choice effectively for children. So again, but your point's well taken, Senator Rothfuss, and we can look at that language because there was no intent to say there would be none. It was to give the option for and for them to choose. And I think that's reflected in the conforming amendment we did on page 20.
Then with that as a friendly amendment, I just suggest, restoring the original language in the first half of the sentence so that the sentence is structured, requires that the ESA student take the statewide assessments administered pursuant to Wyoming statute, blah, 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 and then include an or, and then add the rest of your sentence, which I think you said was normed nationally, some achievement, whatever you said after that. Okay, thanks, yep.
Opposed? No. Not carried. Anything further? Anything further? Representative Andrew.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to page 5, line 11 through to line 19, to strike that language. It's essentially a cleanup amendment. This language is it basically sends the money back to the school foundation program I think it was changed to go back to the general fund. But the original intent of this was, in the original bill, was that there was an automatic flow of money from federal mineral royalties. And if it wasn't used, it was supposed to be sent and then forwarded onto the school foundation program. I believe it doesn't make sense in this bill because any money that's in this bill was directly appropriated by the legislature. And if we appropriated it to be there, it should probably stay there unless we actually make an appropriation in the other direction. So page 5, line 11 to 19, striking that language, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Chairman, correct.
Chairman Northup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I know why this section is in here. This was in here so that the legislature every 2 years had to come back and reappropriate that money. And that was why that was in there. It was the accountability for the legislature to look at it every 2 years and say, is this program working? Is this program not working? If we're not spending but $1 million out of it, and there's $39 million left in it, then it's probably not a very viable program after 2 years. So I don't think that that's the question that it is. It's just more of accountability of saying back to the legislature, take a look at this program every 2 years.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to support the motion. I think that a single appropriation upfront, this bill represents a $40 million appropriation, would be spent in some amount of time, which is actually your point, Chairman Northrop. We don't know how long that would take depending on what demand is. I would expect demand in both sides to maybe start off slower than it would be after some period of time, and you would see a spend rate of that 40 million. And then it just stays there, single appropriation, spend up to $40 million. Maybe that takes 3 years, maybe it takes 1 year. We honestly don't know. But I would expect it to be challenged for the first time. And then the legislature would have to come back as it sees a conclusion to it. So perhaps there's just a couple million left next year. We would then have to decide how much more we want to appropriate to be eligible for the program. I think it's a reasonable approach, and even as it says now, not more than 150% of the amount required to fund all ESAs becomes almost a difficult calculation because you have a hard time projecting, and when would that projection take place? I think Representative Andrews' amendment simplifies things, makes it clean, you track the money easily, and you would have to reappropriate money as the current appropriation wound down. So I'm going to support it as just a cleaner, simpler, easier way to fund the program.
You look at the effective dates. This section is effective January 1st of 2025. So that will be 6 months into a 24-month biennium. But it speaks to the end of the fiscal year. So they'd have 6 months to spend the 40 million or to revert. And so what this amendment does then is potentially stretch that out beyond the end of the fiscal year. I have a suspicion the Appropriations Committee will do something different with it anyhow on the way through, but so have I read that right? In terms
Mr.
of the-
Chairman, yes, I think you're correct that the statutory changes don't take effect until January 1st of 2025, which includes in section 1 and 2. The appropriation included in section 3, which is the $40 million, actually would occur July 1st of 2024. So that amount is a biennialized amount. Another point is on page 5, lines 4 and 5, there's the conforming amendment if you delete C.
Okay,
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, as a friendly amendment, I propose that we include what Tanya just suggested, which is on line 4 going on to line 5. As part of this amendment, we would need to strike, except as provided by subsection C of this section, and then begin with any unencumbered.
now, Tanya, which page, you've lost me on the curve, which page is that?
Mr. Chairman, if you look at 5 on lines 4 and 5, just above the paragraph that you're, subsection that you're looking at striking, it states except as provided by subsection C of this section, which will no longer exist if this amendment is adopted.
For page 4. We're taking out C on page 5, on page,
Page 5.
The proposed
except
amendment,
it's, okay, I see it up here. Okay, that is, I read that as a friendly addition. Okay, everybody understand now? Any further discussion? For the amendment, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
That- 2 noes, that carried. Okay, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to propose amendment on page 14, line 2, and then on line 4. But first on line 2, to delete 50% and insert, okay, I'm sorry, page 14, line 2. Let me know when you're there. Ready? Okay, line 2, delete 50% and replace it with 70%. And then on line 4, delete 50% and substitute with 30%. And that basically changes the balance of the ECA portions, the funds, 70% going to K through 12 and 30% going to early childhood.
Second. Moved and seconded. Am I right in thinking that the 70-30 was the way Speaker Summers explained it yesterday is what he wanted to do?
I believe
No?
he's, huh? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if he said he wanted to do it. I think he said it was acceptable.
Correct,
Said it was-
correct.
Which I often see as two different things.
They are different, and Senator Roth is correct. Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
So that's what this does. Okay? Further discussion? Everybody understand it? Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I keep this brief because I think I know where the committee's going, but I would just say briefly to, I hope you don't support this amendment. There is fewer things than greater payback for what we put into early childhood education in terms of what we spend in other government funding. And for every dollar we put into early childhood, we get paid back multi-folds in what we're paying in prison costs and our criminal justice system. The evidence is very obvious. I think it would greatly benefit the state of Wyoming if we continue to invest 50/50, if we're going to move forward with this bill. Thank you.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Show of hands. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Opposed? 8. 8 carried. Okay. Anything else? Anything else? Representative Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have another amendment to page 10, line 7. The original bill, I have 2 amendments on this, but I'll do this one first. There was quite a bit of language referring to the religious freedom that parents have. And much of it, I mean, is established constitutional law, but I will refer back to the comment by my good Senate colleague yesterday that, you know, the law isn't only for lawyers, it's for everybody. And that we heard quite a bit of testimony yesterday of people being that were uncomfortable, I think, with certain, you know, freedom aspects of this that I think that adding more language would help with. So back to page 10, line 7, after requires the student to receive instruction in at minimum reading, writing, mathematics, civics, history, literature, and science, adding back in the language from the original bill, no parent shall be required to include any instruction that conflicts with the parents' or the ESA students' religious doctrines. All right. No parent shall be required to include any instruction that conflicts with the parents' or ESA students' religious doctrines, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, and I'll support that motion. That's consistent with what we do in public schools. I don't know why we wouldn't do it in ESAs.
Also, do you have the language?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to propose my second amendment along those lines. So this one refers more to the education service providers, mainly the private schools. It is on page 23, line 22. And so, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, page 23, line 22.
Page 23, lines 1 and 2, okay.
22. So, Mr. Chairman, after section D, or subsection D, I want to add 2 more sections, or subsections, subsection E and subsection G. Subsection E would state that nothing in this act shall be construed to expand the regulatory authority of the state, its officers, or any school district to impose any additional regulation of education service providers beyond those necessary to enforce the requirements of the ESA program. Subsection G would read, an education service provider shall not be required to alter its creed, practices, admission policy, or curriculum to accept any payments authorized by a parent from an ESA. And essentially, I mean, public school or private schools are already regulated in law to some small extent. They have to teach the subjects we talked about in relation to the earlier amendment. But this ensures that they still have their constitutional rights to have their own belief and be independent, regardless of if ESA students are attending their schools or not.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
To have the language is, let's see if LSO got it, yeah.
I think what Representative Andrew is trying to do is on the substitute bill that you reviewed this morning, or Senate File 143 from last year, on page 25, subsections E and F on lines 14 through 22 is what he's requesting to be put in this bill. Is that correct, Representative Andrew?
Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, it's E and G that he's requesting, but on that page, so not F, as I understand it. Mr. Chairman?
And G and F.
Mr. Chairman, can we divide that motion and address them separately? Thank you. E first. Yep. Additional regulation of education service providers beyond those necessary to enforce requirements.
Is that the first division?
Yeah.
Okay, it's divisible. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. On E, thought I had it. On E, I guess my question is, if there, I don't understand how this necessarily works. Either it does nothing or it does something bad, and I'm trying to figure out which of those two things happens. This act is very specifically calling out the state through the first part of the act to provide regulations on what an education service provider can do to receive $3,000 in an ESA. I mean, that's literally everything above it. And then this paragraph seems to say that we shouldn't construe anything above it, adding additional requirements to an education service provider. I don't know how those two concepts comport with one another. So can you describe what the intent of this paragraph will be?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. The only regulation that we actually impose on an education service provider, provided that education service provider is actually a school, is the regulation that they currently have to follow, and that is that they have to teach the basic subject areas that anyone would be expected to teach in schools. The rest of the regulation is actually on the families and the students to ensure that they are spending the money for the intended purposes of an ESA.
Now, Mr. Chairman, can you give me an example of what you think this paragraph, how it might be helpful, what it might do that we would want it for?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't believe that there's anything in this bill that necessarily proposes burdensome regulation on private schools. But and that's a great thing. I just think it's necessary for someone reading the bill and maybe wanting to provide public comment, as they did yesterday, to see that this is the legislative intent, is that we are not going to further regulate public schools, but rather place parents in a position where they have the choice and the funds to make the decision to go to those schools.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think I'm going to conclude that it does nothing and probably does nothing bad. I'm not going to vote for it, but I don't think I'm worried about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I want to clarify. So then with the rules promulgated by the Department of Education, they would still, I think I see that they have a surety bond for education services that goes to the educational institution rather than just the parents. Is that the only place? Like, it's hard for me to understand how that will affect the rulemaking process, I guess.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize, but I'm not exactly sure what the question was. But yes, I believe that the surety bond was the only thing in there. But again, that goes back to the handling of money and a protection against fraud rather than the actual practices of the school. Mr. Chairman, the second division added another subsection that was G in the original bill. I believe, if I'm tracking this right, it would be F if we added it here. An education service provider shall not be required to alter its creed, practices, admission policy, or curriculum to accept payments authorized by a parent from an ESA.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think this one is troublesome. I understand the intent, but I think it gets into unconstitutional territory. If my admission policy is that we don't want to have the resources to accept students with disabilities that are recognized under IDEA that have an IEP. I'll make that my admission policy, and we still get the ESA, but we're clearly discriminating. I could do the same thing and say, we will absolutely not accept anybody that is not of the same faith as our provider. That, again, would be discrimination on a religious basis for the use of public funds. And I understand that there are desires along those lines, but at the end of the day, these are public funds. And this goes down the unconstitutional path pretty far. I think there was a lot of care taken by the speaker in preparing the original draft to take out the pieces that were blatantly flagging unconstitutionality. And I think this G paragraph is one that blatantly flags unconstitutionality. So I guess I'll ask this: what specifically do we want to achieve through a G paragraph that we find to be acceptable, constitutional, and without it would not take place?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is already in the law regulation, limited regulation on who private schools can and cannot discriminate against. There's certain allowances, depending on if it is a religious school or not a religious school. But the whole purpose of the way we have written this bill is we are not funding private schools. as a state. We are funding students and parents. Then, I mean, we're funding a program the parents can apply for where they can then direct those funds that are their funds to where they want their child to go. And if we don't put this in, first of all, I think if we don't put it in, it actually probably exists. This is more, again, I think it's clarifying language, but it's not a case of, if we were to do something like this, it would be a case of regulating private schools. And probably, depending on what you get into, you could be violating their First Amendment rights as private religious schools.
I think the concern or the difference here is that it's the moment they're accepting public funds, and even if the public funds are going to the parent for the education of their student, that's the obligation, and the limits of what statute and the First Amendment will allow is further than the limits of what is allowed under the Wyoming Constitution for use of public funds. So it's not that you're incorrect, Representative, from the standpoint of allowances under the First Amendment, but we have multiple factors that weigh into the constitutionality, and no institution would be obligated to accept these ESA payments, right? So we would not be obligating an infringement. But if an entity wants to accept these ESA payments, then those ESA payments need to follow a constitutional path from the use of those. And at that point, I think we would be hard pressed to allow blatantly discriminatory policies to be funded with state funds when we don't have an obligation to do that, and when it's optional for that facility to be accepting it. So again, I find this to be constitutionally troublesome as a provision, and I think it ends up weakening the constitutionality of the ESA component or the K-12 ESA component of the bill.
Mr. Chair.
Is the argument over all the language, or is the argument strictly over the admission policy language? Because it would seem that when you're talking about creed and practices and curriculum, you're talking about asking them to change the nature of their religion, which we can't do. But admission policies, we can say thou shalt not discriminate on the basis of race, for example. What am I missing here?
Mr. Chairman, from my perspective, striking admission policy is fine, and then it makes, nothing comes to mind immediately as a constitutional concern from creed practices or curriculum.
Mr. Chairman, the admissions policy part is important because private schools do have the right, if they want to say that those, the students there are a member of that religion, for example. But the part where I think we're getting off track is that these schools are not accepting public funds. That is the entire reason that we establish an education savings account, because those funds belong to the parents. The state appropriated to a program that was then available to the parents. The parents receive the money in the account. The state is the custodian of those accounts, but the account belongs to the parent. So the money that goes to the school, whatever it is, it's private funds and no longer public funds.
Representative Obermuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as an analogy, when the IRS looks at the flow of money, there's a principle called the step transaction. So the money flows into, let's say, an individual, and then that individual moves it to this box, and then moves it to this box, and then over to this box, and then it ends up somewhere. And the IRS says, we're going to ignore all those boxes in between. Where did the money start, and where did it end up? And I think long-term, that's what you're going to deal with in this environment. Ultimately, the government will be interested in where the money ends up and will ignore that there was a parent box in between that money. Thank you.
As I understand where we are now, the question before us is, are we going to adopt this language that is in this paragraph G, page 26, lines 1 through 4 of the bill from last year? And that's strictly the question before us. Senator Ruffus.
I'll move to amend the amendment to strike admission policy and leave the rest of it in place. And if that passes, I'll vote for the motion. I'm fine with it.
Okay. Is there a second? Do I have a second? Do I have a second? I have a second. Okay. Discussion on that, Senator Beitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and against the amendment to the amendment. If we adopted that, then realistically, you could just wipe out girls' schools, because that's an admission policy. And this is the reason why G's in there, or is supposed to be in there, is to keep the government out of it. And this is the no strings attached amendment, is what I would call it. If G's not in there, there's going to be so many people trying to dictate what the money can and cannot be used for to these private entities. And it's really going to mess this bill up big time. And we don't see it with Pell Grants, like I said yesterday. It's not a condition of accepting a Pell Grant that your school has to change its creed, principles, admission policies, and curriculum. You just get the money. No strings attached. Why would we want strings attached to this program? That's what we're doing if we don't adopt G. So on and against.
It stands before us right now is it's an amendment to the proposed amendment. It's taking out the admission policy language from the amendment. So it's strictly limited to that particular phrase. And the question is, do we want to retain the government's ability to say, no, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, et cetera, in accepting this money? Or do we want to put that ability to discriminate on an equal par with we aren't going to allow the government to tell them what they believe in and what how their curriculum reflects their religion? Okay, is that a right understanding of the situation we've got?
Mr. Chairman, I would refer back to, and I wish I was better prepared to explain this part, but private schools are still regulated on their admissions policy to some extent. There are exceptions. You can have girls' schools. If you're a particular religion, you can say that only people from our religion can come to the school. But I think really the foundation of the argument we're having is it public money or is it private money? Because if we are to change this on the basis that this is public money, then this whole bill actually probably is unconstitutional. The point of this and the way we make it constitutional is that this becomes private money when it's in an ESA, and the parent can appropriate it. If we're just giving public money straight to private schools, then there is a problem with that. But if we're allowing parents to use it and direct it themselves to where it goes, then we don't have an issue with it.
Anything, you're ready to vote? All those in favor of the amendment, and if you're in favor of the amendment, you're in favor of taking the words admission policies out of the proposed draft. So all those in favor of that, say aye, or raise your hand. We'll just do a show of hands start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, okay, opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It failed. It passed, excuse me, 7 in favor, 6 against. Taking those words out. Now we're back on the main motion, which is to put in this paragraph without the words admission policy. Everybody understand that? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carried. Okay. Any further amendments? Senator Brennan.
I have a couple of amendments. The first one would be on page 12, line 12, after 21-2-904.
Page 12, line 12.
Mhm. We heard testimony yesterday that homeschoolers aren't sure exactly where they would stand in the bill that we have before us. So this would just give homeschoolers a way to know where they stand and to opt out. So we would add G, and it would say, nothing in this act shall be construed to require an ESA student to be enrolled full-time or part-time in a private school or a non-public online school. An ESA student receiving individualized instruction in a non-school setting shall not be construed to be a home-based education program as defined in WS 21-4-101A5.
Mr. Chairman, where is that? I know it's in the bill.
It's on page 11, down lines 21.
Thank you. In the sub bill, it's in there.
Well, starting on 19.
Mr. Chairman, I would point out that the section directly above that, subsection F, has a portion of that language that already exists. I don't know if you want to amend that or if you want to restate it, but it could be duplicative.
Oh, so yeah, we just need to add the language back in on F, just continue that language.
Okay, so we're making the F in the bill we're considering consistent with the F in the 143 bill. That's what you did.
Yes.
Okay, does everybody understand that? Now, so does that make sense to you guys? Okay.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I would propose that we amend 21-903A, which deals with the dollar amount from $3,000 up to $8,000.
Okay, $3,000 up to $8,000. What's the page and line on that?
Page, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, it's on page 4, lines 14 and 15.
4, line 14 and 15.
Second.
Okay, did I hear a second on that idea? Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, my concern here, that it's a fixed pie of $40 million. And so what's really going to happen is you're going to take that $40 million and divide it by whatever number we have for the dollars per ESA. And that's the number of people that will have access to this service. So anytime we increase the number of dollars, we decrease the number of people. The testimony that we heard from the speaker yesterday seems to suggest that this $3,000 roughly divides into $40 million to roughly equal the number of people that seem to be out there that would be in demand of a program like this. The concern I have with the amendment is then we create the first come, first serve rush where it really does matter who signs up first, because we don't have enough ESA slots to meet demand. On the pre-K side, which is really the side that I'm in this bill for, it's very much lined out, I think, where that $3,000 times about 4,000 people equals $12 million, which is what the appropriation would be. And I'm worried that if we up that to $8,000, it doesn't do anything to serve more people. It just provides more funding to the institutions. I'd also suggest that when we saw the specific tuition that was provided by the institutions that were advocating for the K-12 system yesterday, those tuitions that they were charging were around $5K. So this is all a trade-off, and we can kind of choose whatever we want. Do you want more people eligible, or do you want more dollars per eligible person? I'm comfortable with the 3,000. I think 8,000 is way too high. Maybe 3,000 isn't perfect. Maybe 5,000 is better. But 8,000 sounds like a lot more than what we need and would cut by more than half the number of people that would be eligible by for the program. And my priority is going to be helping more of those low-income people, as many as we possibly can, to have access. So I'm against the motion for 8,000.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and for the amendment. When I talked to folks back home about, the money following the backpack, this mostly really came about during COVID when we were all thrust into the role of teachers. And a lot of people that in my community said, man, if we could get 19,000 or whatever the average is per student to educate our kids, we could do a great job. Imagine if we could pool our money together and hire a teacher for the 2 families. With that money, we could hire a great teacher and our kids would get a great education. I think 8,000 is too low. I think what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I think that the parent should get exactly what the average per pupil funding is for public education. That's not what we're offering here. It's only 8,000. I still think you can get a great education for $8,000. I think it's appropriate and I support the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of the discussion about accountability going back to, I think we're giving the department 2 people to oversee that this money is used wisely. I'm very skeptical that is going to be done, that's enough resources to assure accountability for what this funding is going to. And we heard yesterday testimony that some of the money in other states is going to buy all sorts of fun things that don't necessarily equate to this. So without a proper accountability mechanism, $8,000 sure gets me a lot of fun toys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When our constituents don't understand how the funding model works, it's easy to say, okay, let's take the average. We like the average money. The average money that the state actually subsidizes across the state, that average is around $9,800, but it's not equally distributed. A town like Claremont actually gets like $26,000, somewhere around there per child. Other districts like Sweetwater send money into the system to be distributed to places like Ranchester and other schools, that are subsidized by all of the rest of us. So when we say we represent our constituents here, sometimes that requires some constituent education as to how the funding works and how much money is coming into their areas. Can you imagine Claremont, the trade-off for them to get an equitable and adequate education costs around $40,000 per student? And we said to them, instead of that, let's just let the money follow the child, and every child, the state will subsidize whatever your local revenue is by roughly $9,800. And then they can go try to recreate their education programs with equity and adequacy on so much less money. So part of our task is to educate our constituents on how the funding model actually works before we come down here and say we represent them by trying to bring back less money to our communities than they currently get. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, with the $3,000, our low-income families that we're trying to help are still not probably going to be able to use this because it's not going to be enough money, and they're still not going to be able to afford the school choice that they want with $3,000. And that's why I propose that we move it up to $8,000 so that they can. And then we can look at, do we need to appropriate more money for the program?
Well, I think looking at those two things together is important, because if the total number of dollars available is also going to go up by 2 2/3 factor, which then takes it over $100 million of appropriation, then you have equivalency in the number of eligible, but we have a substantial increase. The change to 8,000, and again, the $40 million is biennial, so that's $20 million a year. At $3,000, we're talking $6,666 per year. At $8,000, we're talking 2,500 people per year. That's a substantial change in the number of eligible coverage. And both of those numbers are probably less than demand if fully expanded out, whether we're even at the 6,600. But that is closer to what we heard yesterday as being a probable demand. So I think, again, it's up to individuals to decide, do we want more people covered, or do we want more dollars per coverage? $8,000 is a long ways into we've dramatically decreased the number of people that will participate in this program. On the K-12 education side, since it's 2/3, 1/3, we're talking now only about 1,600 people in the state that would be eligible for the program at 8,000, and about 800 people in the state would be eligible for it on the pre-K. That doesn't even satisfy probably some communities. So again, if there's a desire to increase that number, I think we have to be realistic. We can't have everything, right? It's a fixed pie. So we have to be realistic about saying we're also going to increase at the same time the amount of money available to pay for a sufficient number of people. And the motion should include that if we want to increase it, is let's pay for more, or let's make sure that we understand the sacrifice.
This summer I spent a half day in Minneapolis at the Education Commission of the States, and all we talked about, they had a professional panel from different states that talked about their experiences with vouchers. They went through the fraud parts, they went through the good parts, the bad parts. Some of the questions that came up is what's an appropriate funding for vouchers? The panel really kind of settled at $4,000 to $5,000. Whether that's right for Wyoming or not, That's what the panel kind of came up with. We talked about the poverty level. They thought 250% was too low. They thought 300% was a better level. Again, whether that's right for Wyoming or not. Again, they shared a lot of the fraud things that they had seen and some suggestions. So I guess I feel 8,000 is too high. I feel 3,000 is too low. So if this fails, I guess I'll make another amendment, maybe for 4,500 is probably where I'm sitting at personally.
I will say that from my experience, this is the kind of thing that the committee doesn't settle. If the bill goes through the full legislature, we'll settle it and probably debate at considerable length what the real number ought to be. So the motion is to raise it from 3,000 to 8,000. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
That failed. Okay? Further? Representative Overman.
Mr. Chairman, I understand what you're saying about it. It's, it gets litigated on the floor like that. But I don't think the committee should just build a straw man to be knocked down. I'm not in favor of this particular method, but I think the bill that comes out has to be realistic in my view. We can't just say, well, it's 3,000, it's not going to work, which of course it can't because it's directed toward people that can't afford to pay the rest of the tuition, and the churches can't pick that difference up. So I don't want to build that model from out of this committee. So I would move that we move the number from 3,000 to 6,000, or no, I'm sorry, 3,000 to 5,000, which seemed to be kind of the number talked about. So it's more realistic in terms of the cost.
Motion is 3,000 to 5,000. Second. Any further debate, any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carried. Are you ready for a vote on the bill as a whole?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment, please.
Another amendment.
Or we could take a break and come back.
I think we can carry through for one more amendment.
Okay.
I want to get this done.
Yep. Okay. So my amendment's on page 6. Let's see here. Line 14, after the comma, after resident, delete the balance of the line, delete line 15, 16, 17 to the comma after income. Takes out the means test, Mr. Chairman.
The K-12 part of the bill, but might for the preschool. But make your own judgment on that. It's clear what we do. Any
Mr.
further
Chairman.
discussion? Further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, can I propose an amendment to the amendment to apply the means test to the pre-K portion, but not to the K through 12 portion?
That's friendly. Okay, so we're taking out the means test, and LSO, you'll have to do a little drafting on that. We're taking out the means test for the K-12 portion, but not the pre-K portion. Okay? Everybody understand? Senator Office.
I do understand. I just reiterate that, again, you've got demand and you've got plenty of people in the state that don't have any problem whatsoever paying for education. From the constitutional standpoint, it is complex. I know everybody wants to believe that's a proponent that it's always constitutional under all circumstances. I don't think it's so clear cut. I think if you have a means test available for the K-12 portion, you go a long ways towards making it constitutional and satisfying the court's interests. If you don't have that means test, it's going to be very much more constitutionally challenged. I appreciate, though, the fact that the means test was left for the early childhood. So thanks for that. I think that keeps that nicely constitutional. So I guess vote it up or vote it down. I'm going to vote it down, but we'll see how it goes.
Again, maybe a friendly amendment to the amendment, but I think the 250% is too low, and I don't know if you're open to changing that percentage.
Let's do that as a second.
Separate? Okay.
No.
I think the noes have it. We're going to have a show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Failed. Okay. Anything further?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I propose that on page 6, beginning line 14 and 15, that we take out 250% and put 350%.
Whoa. Moved and seconded. Okay. We're going to have a very mild means test. Representative Overton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what does that mean in real dollars on the poverty level?
What does it mean?
How much is it? How much money?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, my understanding is from the testimony yesterday, is what I'm going on, is that would be about combined income of a family of 156, up to 156,000, but it takes in 43% more people.
LSO, do you know the numbers?
Mr. Chairman, according to the 2023 guidelines, 350% for a family of 4 would be 105,000.
105,000. Okay. And I will say, I've not seen us do a means test that high, but Obamacare does have one, goes up to 400% of federal poverty, so there is some precedent.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might add, the 250% a family of 4 is 75,000.
75, so it's taken from 75 to 105,000. Okay, thank you, LSO. Any further discussion? Senator Office.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. On and against, and I think that opens it up too much. I might be comfortable going to 300%, but I think 250% based on the numbers we saw, again, starts to meet supply and demand. I think we would be doing a disservice to the people if there were a lot of folks that ran out, right? If we implemented a program where the demand for the vouchers dramatically exceeded the availability, and you just didn't show up in time. Boy, I can't imagine a more angry set of constituents for all of us than a situation where we passed something where some of the people at 349% of the federal poverty level were able to get into the program, but that person at 100% of the federal poverty level regrettably had to work 3 shifts that day to get to their 100% of the federal poverty level, and they weren't able to log in time to sign up for the ESA program. And again, if we want to raise the number of people eligible, I think we need to start right-sizing the budget and make sure that we don't create a land rush. So this does seem like the kind of thing we can work on in the session when we have all of the numbers and all of the data to figure out how much does it cost to have a certain participation rate at a certain federal poverty level for a certain budget with a given maximum amount of the ESA. Without knowing that, I don't know how much tweaking we really should do, and 250% was the research we heard, which seems to be roughly right-sized. I would suggest that we go with that for now, and then start getting some research drawn up to understand the implications of changes to federal poverty level, amount per voucher, and other factors.
Anybody else? Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
The noes have it. Division being called. All those in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 failed. Are we ready for the vote on the bill? Are we ready to vote on the bill? Seeing nothing.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I have one more minute.
No, we're gonna get this bill done, well done.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I hope this one is simple enough, maybe not, but page 19, line 6, this was something that in the first round of public testimony, the state superintendent's office brought up. It's too long ago for me to reiterate exactly what they said, but I think that 20%, the burden audit, 20% of all ESAs was a pretty high burden. And I'm wondering if it would be favorable to the committee to strike not less than 20% and insert a statistically significant sample. And I guess the burden would be on them to determine what that is, but.
Moved and seconded, they got 20%.
A statistically significant sample.
So as we have it crafted right now, there could be around 4,000 vouchers per year. 20% of that would be 400. That sounds like an awful lot. Perhaps 100 is a reasonable number. We could just sort of, that would be 5%. The statistically significant could be substantially lower than that, but it seems like 100 audits just looking into the veracity of it a year is rational. So rather than statistically significant, perhaps we can just say 5% of all, or maybe even a lower number than that. 2% becomes 80. 400, 800, I'm sorry, my apologies, 800 on 4,000, yes, 800, so that is an awful lot. 2% would be what, 160 at that point. I mean, 80 at that point.
Yeah, and it's not less.
Right. So I support the concept. I think it's the right concept. Statistically significant would be challenging from a statutory standpoint, I think.
Mr. Chairman, I don't understand that last statement. Why would that be challenging from a?
I think they would then have to determine internally what they contemplate to be statistically significant and why. And honestly, based on the variance in the data, I mean, statistically significant ends up taking on meaning of how many do you need to show a counter trend. If you had a statistically significant sample and have a substantial amount of what's variation? Did you comply or not comply? It's binary at that point. I don't know. I don't find it, having done plenty of statistics, to really be something I can wrap my mind around, I'll say. from a statutory standpoint, just providing a percentage, which 2 or 3% is plenty.
Mr. Chairman.
So I want to follow up on,
2% would be a friendly amendment too. 2% would be a friendly amendment if we want to go with that. My second agrees.
Based on the maximum number.
That seems reasonable.
It's not less than.
Is that your motion, 2%?
Mr. Chairman, not less than 2%.
Less than 2%.
um,
Okay, the motion is changed to 20%. 2% and the not less than language stays in, so they can do more. Yeah, and that, we did hear from the state superintendent about that. Okay.
all right.
Devolver.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's unfortunate that the bringer of the amendment changed his view on that because, if you take percentages of things and look at them, you can't draw any general conclusions. You really can't. You have 2%, you look at those 2%, it's true for those 2%, it doesn't represent the rest. So, what this needs to say is statistically significant at a 95% or some percentage of confidence in the sample size. That's what you need here. So that when you look at the items, you can make inferences and judgments about the rest of the population. Otherwise, you cannot do that.
I think of the problem the superintendent was talking to us about, and I think this is one of those things that it comes through, we can get more sophisticated language. So, any further discussion? All those in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carried. Back on the bill. Back on the bill, seeing no further discussion, call the roll, please.
Mr. Chairman, on 24 LSO-0052, education savings accounts as amended, Senator Beitman?
No.
Senator Brennan?
No.
Senator Rothfuss?
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz?
No.
Representative Allred?
Aye.
Representative Andrew?
Aye.
Representative Berger?
No.
Representative Brown left an absentee of aye. Representative Clouston?
Aye.
Representative Lawley?
Aye.
Representative Obermueller?
No?
Representative Provenza?
No.
Co-Chairman Northrup?
Yes.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Seven aye, 6 no. Sorry, I miscounted again. Eight aye, 6 no. I forgot Brown was here.
Okay, that
was
carried.
voted. I just-
Committee, we're going to take a break until 10:40. And then come back and we'll.
I have a whole lot of fun, ready to go.
Yeah, me too. Oh, you'll get, you saved all your ammo for the floor.
I guess, yeah.
Oh, did? Oh, yeah,
I'm here
okay.
to comment publicly today on equitable funding for Strive Learning Center, where I work.
Oh, yeah, okay. All right, nice to see you again, yeah. And you, as I recall, you brought some food over to our house when we were babysitting the kids, I believe.
Yeah.
So I didn't forget that.
Yeah, well, thank you.
we'll resume, and we're finally under the part of the agenda that was scheduled for today. We're talking about the Developmental Preschool Funding Bill, 24 LSO 201. LSO, proceed.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Tanya Heitrick, Legislative Service Office. As you stated, we're here to discuss 24 LSO 201, Working Draft 4, Developmental Preschool Funding. Recall at your August meeting, you requested staff to work with the Department of Health officials to prepare draft legislation to update the amounts that are utilized to allocate funding to the developmental preschools, as well as the amounts that are utilized in their preparation of their budget, to reflect those ECAs that were adopted in the K-12 model. And so on page 1, you'll note that section 1 begins on line 10 and amends 21-2-706. This is the developmental preschool funding statute. And the substantive amendment can be found on lines 11 and 12, which increases the per child amount from $8,503 to $10,115, an increase of $1,612. The amount associated for social and emotional learning, which can be found on lines 20 and 21, is increased from $363 to $432, an increase of $69. There's a conforming amendment that's required on page 3, line 2, noting that commencing in 2026, the budget request made by the Department of Health will utilize these amended figures. Section 2, found on page 3, line 12 through page 4, line 2, appropriates $12 million from the general fund to be allocated in accordance with the revised statutes that I've discussed. You'll note on page 4, there is a staff comment that discusses the appropriation of $12 million, $290,328 for purposes of funding, and I'll let Mr. Woolmarth discuss the calculation and determining the appropriation in a moment. The effective date is on line 21 of page 4. This act is effective July 1st of 2024.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Matt Wilmarth, Legislative Service Office. Again, as Mrs. Heitrick indicated, the committee directed LSO to work with the Department of Health after the August meeting to arrive at these adjusted amounts. And in doing so, we identified the practice that the Department of Health takes in requesting its exception request to increase these amounts within its budget to reflect the external cost adjustments enacted by the legislature to the education resource block grant model. In the discussions with the Department of Health, we discovered that they utilize only the educational materials index. And so in discussions with the chairman, when we put these figures together, LSO used a weighted average of the ECAs that have been enacted for each of the 4 components that are adjusted within the block grant. So the amounts within the bill reflect a weighted ECA for each of the ECAs enacted and adopted by the legislature. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so it reflects a cumulative ECA of those enacted or not sustained and taken off throughout each of the years since 2010. And so what you see in the bill is that weighted ECA amount, and it does not just only reflect what the Department of Health has historically requested of just the education materials index. And Mr. Chairman, it does reflect the most recent ECA enacted in the 2023 session. It does not reflect what the Joint Education Committee recommended to be enacted for school year 24-25. that if that's enacted by the legislature in the 2024 session, would be requested the following supplemental budget request by the Department of Health. With that, Mr. Chairman, I can take any questions on the methodology used to update these figures.
Mr. Chairman, one final note on the bill, and I should have mentioned this. It's not only utilized for purposes of calculating the budget and the exception request, but it's also utilized for purposes of calculating the amount that it is provided to the service providers as well.
I'll make a couple of observations here. Normally, something like this would be handled strictly through the budget process, but we've got specific figures in the statutes here, and so we need to amend the statutes, and that's not good form to amend the statutes in the budget bill. So that, long-term, that may be a problem that at some point we ought to fix. Be that as it may, that's the situation right now. So you have this bill as a vehicle. And again, the final figure probably settled at the budget session one way or another, because there's obvious interplay with the budget as a whole, and the Joint Appropriations Committee, given the House and Senate rules, will be involved in this bill. I will, when we get to the public testimony, I suspect we'll hear from some of the providers, and we heard it in July, or at the August meeting rather, some testimony about some considerable financial distress, because we've got a situation here where basically the feds are setting the standard of care in their regulations and enforcing, and those are enforced fairly vigorously. And we'll want to hear the extent to which these numbers, which we calculate in kind of a formula basis, deal with the real problems that are there, because we can change these numbers, and we can change them in this committee, or we can change them on the floor, and there will be an interaction with the legislature as a whole, make a final decision, and the Appropriations Committee will have its say. So this is the first step in a fair process, but we will want to know to what extent is this solving the immediate problem that we're getting right now. And I would point out to the committee that this has considerable implications for K-12 funding, because the DD preschools deal with developmental disabilities in the preschool area, which is often, in terms of the development of the student, the better time to deal with it, cheaper to do it then, and they don't cost as much as the K-12 system. So if they don't get the job done, they aren't funded well enough, can't get the job done, we potentially could see a much larger burden on the K-12 system, where it's 100% state reimbursement. So that's an implication this committee needs to be sensitive to. So with that, are you representing the Health Department?
Mr. Chairman, yes. My name is Matt Petrie. I'm the Senior Administrator for the Behavioral Health Division of the Department of Health.
Okay, do you wish to add anything to the presentation we've had so far?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, and I'll be brief, there was another document that was provided to you as part of the agenda, in addition to the bill itself. Really just gives some background on the early intervention and education program. I can step through that relatively quickly, or if everyone feels like they have a fairly good understanding of it, I could move to a discussion of the way that we calculate the external cost adjustment now and how that compares to what is proposed in the bill, possibly just to add to what Mr. Wilmarth has provided.
See if the committee has any before we get there. My understanding is, well, there's two issues. My understanding is that in terms of the care that's provided and who's eligible and who isn't, the feds set some fairly detailed standards on this and claim that they have authority to do that under the 14th Amendment that is independent of the federal financing. So if we got rid of the federal financing, we don't get rid of the federal requirements. First question, is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it is. The program itself is governed at the federal level, at the national level, by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There's basically 4 parts to that act. 2 of those 4 parts cover our early intervention and education program, parts B and C. Part B is federally mandated, and it serves children ages 3 through 5. Obviously, every state in the nation participates. Part C serves individuals, children, birth through age 2. That's optional for states, but all 50 states have opted into that. What you see because of that difference between the 2 age groups is that the Department of Education, the broader part of Part B, is that it really governs children, the education of children ages 3 through 21. At the Department of Health, in the early intervention and education program, we only deal with those children ages 3 through 5. Department of Education obviously has the authority for those children ages basically from their 5th birthday through their 21st birthday. So the appropriations that we have for this program, the appropriations for Part B, again, that part that is federally mandated for 3 through 5-year-olds, is a pass-through appropriation from the Department of Education. We are considered a local education agency, an LEA. It's probably a term that you've heard before. This Department of Education is the SEA, the State Education Authority. What that means is that in some respects, the early intervention and education program is considered the 49th school district in the state. Obviously much different than the K-12 districts, but in some respects subject to the same types of requirements. So that is pass-through funding. The funding for Part C there is a federal component to it as well, but it does not come to the Department of Education and then is passed through to the Department of Health. It comes directly to the Department of Health. There's obviously a large state appropriation for both sides of the program, both Part B and Part C. Part C can also benefit from local donations, charitable donations, if you will. To touch on the latter part of your question, anytime, of course, that we have federal funds involved, there is a match requirement. And in essence, for both Part B and Part C, you must maintain the level of state funding that you had in the previous year or the subsequent year. There are some exceptions. There are some things that can happen that would allow the states to reduce their funding, but they're really pretty limited in scope. And so the appropriation, the state appropriation for this program is relatively fixed at the bottom end. As long as we continue to serve the same or a greater number of children, that appropriation, that expectation increases, and the federal government expects it to stay that way. Failure to fund the programs at the same level, with the same level of state funding, brings consequences from the federal government. And those consequences are really the federal government demanding recovery of some of its funds for the program. And that's not proactive. That's not a penalty that's assessed into the future to say we will reduce your federal grant amount. It is an actual recovery of funds for the time period that the grants were made. So there certainly are some federal strings attached, much more so for the 3 to 5-year-olds. The funding that is requested by the Department of Health on an annual basis, is required statutorily. We're required to bring a request for an external cost adjustment every year. We do. That's no different. This year, our exception request follows the exact same methodology that it has followed for years and years, using the inflationary cost index that Mr. Wilmarth indicated, which is one of the 4 that is used for the K-12 system, and it's for educational supplies and materials.
I remember this as chairman of committee 10, the maintenance of effort here can be a real nightmare trying to figure out what it is. Are we in trouble with that provision right now? And does this bill have an effect on what the maintenance of effort is and the maintenance of effort going forward?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it does. Maintenance of effort can be tricky because when you have situations, say 2 or 3 years ago, when we went through a round of budget cuts from state general funded programs, those budget cuts then potentially put us in violation of maintenance of effort requirements. And so what you have seen historically is that the consequences of cutting state funding to the Part B portion of the program is significantly more complicated and potentially carries more consequences than cuts to the Part C program. So what you will see is that the 2 parts of the program, Part B and Part C, on a per child basis, they're funded differently. Part of the reason for that is that when there is a state fund reduction through a budget cut or something like that, at least in this last instance, more of that budget cut was pushed to the Part C side of the ledger than to the Part B part. The rationale behind that historically is that if there were a budget cut, we would split it halfway. Part of it would be absorbed by Part B, part of it would be absorbed by Part C. But the funding amounts are really considerably different. Part B is funded about twice as much as Part C. So when you apply a budget cut evenly across the 2, the effect is much greater on the smaller appropriation for Part C. There's also a tendency when you're faced with a budget cut like that to push it to Part C because the child development centers have the ability to potentially offset that with some charitable donations. But charitable donations vary greatly from program to program across the state. And it really puts pressure on the CDCs to backfill budget cuts with local donations in order to avoid maintenance of effort compliance issues.
Particularly for some of the newer members. In the past, this maintenance of effort issue has been a major problem here, and it inhibits new appropriations. It distorts what we do in terms of running an effective program. As you, in the future, face new federal programs that have maintenance of efforts, that kind of requirement is cause not to accept a federal program. It can get you in real trouble. So just take a warning from our experience here. This one we need it because it keeps our special ed costs down. But the feds have been a real problem with this. So am I right in thinking that we aren't in any trouble with this bill with the maintenance of effort? Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. It changes the methodology of how the external cost adjustment is calculated, but you would still have an additional appropriation. And as it stands now, whether we use the existing methodology or under this bill, external cost adjustments are cumulative. And what I mean by that is that, say last year, we came with an exception request under state statute of an amount over $11 million. Ultimately, the appropriation that we received was $4 million. That unfunded portion of $7 million carries forward into the next year's request. And so these external cost adjustments, these inflationary cost indexes truly are cumulative. And so when, regardless of whether we're asking through the existing methodology in our exception budget request or through the bill, there is an ask to make the programs whole for those inflationary cost pressures over time.
The maintenance of effort requirements tied specifically to federal funds. What percentage of the funds in this program are federal?
Mr. Chairman, I can't answer that question exactly, though I can tell you that it's probably at least a 4-to-1 ratio of state funding to federal funding, with state funding being the much higher figure. Yes.
Thank you all very much. Did you cover everything you needed to?
Mr. Chairman, yes. The only other thing I might mention to you that may be of note, you can see it on page 3 of that second document. Well, actually, 2 things of note. You can see that I'm on, beginning with page 2, you'll see a table in the middle of page 2. That lists the types of components that are used by the K-12 system for external cost adjustments. Those are weighted, obviously. You're going to spend much more money on professional staff than, say, on educational supplies and materials. So the inflationary index that's tied to professional staff will carry more weight ultimately. That last one that you see in that table, educational supplies and materials, 19.477%, very much an accurate figure. You can see very wide swings in that one index. I think that a aggregated or a combined index probably smooths out some of those peaks and valleys to some degree. Whether one is advantageous or disadvantageous to the programs, I really could not comment on. The only other thing I might mention, Mr. Chairman, is on page 3 of that handout, you will see another table a little bit more involved than the one on page 2, but this is the history of funding of external cost adjustments for the child development centers for really an 11-year period. You can see there's a column there entitled external or ECA and MOE requested. That top figure of $16.2 million is our exception request for the upcoming biennium. Technically, it is only for the first year of the biennium. If it were fully funded, it would apply to the biennium, but any portion of it that were not funded, we would come back again statutorily to ask for that balance in the 2025 session, in addition to any new external cost adjustment. The four far right columns, I think, give you an idea of how appropriations and per student funding has progressed, or in some cases digressed, over that 11-year period. Those would be my only additional comments, Mr. Chairman, for understanding of the funding of the program.
Understand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering if you could explain to us, because in the bill, it said it will be included in the standard budget if we fund it. And so you're saying we'd come back just for the portion that we didn't fund, say if we give you half of it, you'd keep coming back for that every year until that was satisfied. Is that correct? And then just remind me where that falls in your budget request, if you would. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, that is correct. And just as an example, I might have you look at that table again on page 3. You can see in the fourth column entitled ECA and MOE requested, the second row below that column heading, there's a figure of roughly $11 million. Immediately to the right of that, you can see an appropriation of $4 million. That left a $7 million balance that was unfunded for this current fiscal year. So when we come in with our request for the upcoming fiscal year 25, we take that $7 million, we add that to the external cost adjustment requested due to this most recent ECA, or this most recent cost inflation index. We add those together, and that's our total ask. And you can see that repeat itself throughout this table. And that regardless of whether the bill is passed or whether we maintain the existing methodology, that approach would remain consistent.
And the bill changes the numbers but does not change the system. What we're seeing in here, the system is unchanged.
Mr. Chairman, that's accurate. It basically rebases that at the 2026 budget with the numbers that are identified in the bill.
Okay. Yes? Okay, thank you all very much. Public testimony. Do we have any state agencies that want to testify? We'll take you all first, unless you don't want to go first. Okay, State Department of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members, Dickie Shaner, Department of Ed, speaking on behalf of Superintendent Degenfelder. What you just discussed is sort of the thing that we're trying to sort out ourselves right now. The superintendent spoke publicly in favor of the ECA for CDCs that's contained within the Department of Health's budget. She maintains that support. I guess what we don't understand is what's the best path forward in terms of this bill with the new formula versus the existing ECA that will be in the, presumably in the governor's recommendation, Department of Health's budget. So I don't know what the best path forward is. We don't have a suggestion on that, but just wanted to reiterate her support, at least at this time, for the ECA in the Department of Health's budget.
This committee, I think, it joins you in saying we don't know what the best path forward is, but we're following an all of the above approach and trying to get all the vehicles we can in front of the session so that we can deal with it.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Introduce yourself and proceed.
Chairman Scott, Co-Chairman Northrup, and committee members, my name is Max Rohn, and I'm in the 4th grade. We are learning about Wyoming history. I am here in support of the CDCs. Thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Appreciate it. Any questions? We appreciate you actually coming and saying a few words to us.
Chairman, co-chairman, committee members, my name is Alicia Rohn. I'm the executive director of the Child Development Center in Natrona County. And I wanted to speak briefly with you in regard to the draft bill. First, from all of the CDCs who I'm speaking for, thank you for the draft bill. I think that was Representative Provenza and Senator Rothfuss's idea in that meeting, and we really appreciate it. As you know, we are in a state of crisis right now with equitable funding for the CDCs. And if we don't receive sufficient funding this legislative session, 3 of our CDCs will start the process to close. And then who will care for Wyoming's children birth to 5 that are in need of early intervention services? Obviously, this year, with the external cost adjustment request and the draft bill, that's simply to get us through to keep our doors open. By next legislative session, we're working on a new funding model for early intervention, which we will bring forth to you. I would like to request an amendment to the bill for you to consider. Currently, our child count is on December 1st. That means on that one day, however many children we are serving is what we get funding for. Currently, today, I have 63 children in process for early intervention services, birth to 5. There is no way I am going to get those 63 children through a comprehensive evaluation and on count by December 1st. That will probably leave 30 to 35 children that I will get on early intervention services at my center without getting any funding for. And so I'll be serving them for a year with early intervention services without funding. Total right now, that would be about $220,000 that I'm taking on to serve these children. That means that it's just simply a loss until the next December 1st count. I'm hoping that you will consider what the school districts do for their count, which is not only average daily attendance, but they take 2 child counts per year, a December 1st count and a May 1st count. And then they average the 2 for their funding. That's how our model used to be. But for some reason, we went to this 1-day count per year, which is simply not equitable. Therefore, I would like for you to consider amendment to the draft bill to change the child count to include a December 1st count and a May 1st count and averaging them both, simply until we get a new funding model in place for early intervention. I appreciate your kind consideration for this amendment and would like to continue to push through the draft bill in conjunction with the external cost adjustment. As you see on the table that Matt Petrie reviewed, we have gone to joint appropriations and requested a external cost adjustment. Last year, we went in with $11 million. We came out with $4 million over 2 years, split amongst 14 regions. That was a drop in the bucket for what we need. In state statute, which we are obligated as a state to serve these children, and in our state statute, it says that we will provide enough funding similar to school districts in order to serve these children, and we are not doing that. We are completely against what it states in our state statute. We have got to create change this year. My biggest fear is that we will go for an external cost adjustment again this year, being 16 million. We'll come out with less, divided amongst 2 years, divided amongst 14 regions, and we're going to close because it is not sufficient. And so I guess I want to see the external cost adjustment and the draft bill go hand in hand. So if that external cost adjustment comes out lower, which we know it will, it always has, or even not at all, that we still have this increase per child amount and a change in the child count to be able to carry us forward. I know there are others here today, so I don't want to take too much of your time, but I'm just simply pleading on behalf of the families that are here today, the thousands of families that we serve across Wyoming, to put this draft bill through as a committee with the amendments, and in turn continue to serve Wyoming's children birth to 5 with much needed early intervention services. I'm here to answer any questions as well.
Make sure I'm understanding. With the figures that are in this bill, so money in local appropriation addition, is that going to be sufficient to, or is that going to be inadequate to keep everybody open?
In order for centers, like you could imagine in Jackson, Wyoming, in order to stay open, they need about a $12,000 per child amount. And if you think about it, The charter schools that just opened receive about $11,000 per child just for general education. Plus they get building, plus they get facilities funds, plus they get transportation funds. That amount is supposed to cover PT, OT, speech, cognitive skill development, preschool, family service coordination, an O&M specialist, a teacher of the deaf specialist, to keep our programs what it is. For me, I have to raise $1 million a year to keep my program what it is. And it is not the donor's responsibility, which I'm thankful for in Natrona County. It is not the donor's responsibility to keep our programs open. It's the state's obligation to keep them open. And so I feel, while we're thankful for any increase, in order to be sufficient for the per child amount, it has got to be up around $12,000.
To 10.5 plus 4.33, am I reading the bill right there?
Yes. And the reason being is that, we are held to the same standards as special education in the school district under IDEA. IDEA is 3 to 21. So even our special education teachers have to have a 2-year master's level endorsement to be able to teach. And so all of my teachers have degrees. All of our program is accredited. We have a curriculum. And I just want to make a point about the $3,000 you brought up earlier, Senator Rothfuss. A child can come to my preschool for $3,000 a year as a typically performing preschool and get a curriculum, get degreed teachers, and we're NACE accredited for pre-K. So I just wanted to touch on your $3,000 amount there. At any rate, with special education, it requires so much more that we have to have, I would say, a minimum of $12,000 per child to get us to where we need to be.
View this bill is not yet adequate.
I don't feel that, while I'm thankful for it, and I'm thankful for the increase because it's much needed, in order to be adequate, the per child amount would need to be at that $12,000 level with 2 child counts per year, averaging them both across the 14 regions, because cost of living in Jackson and paying preschool tuition in Jackson is far different than in Casper or Thermopolis or Worland, et cetera.
In the K-12 system, we have a regional cost adjustment that does deal with Jackson differently. Is that absent in this system?
Yeah, it's absent. We get 1 per child amount, regardless of where you're at, across the 14 regions.
Mr. Brennan.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I have a question too. When you have a student that's receiving services from more than one, so maybe maybe you're getting some that have just speech, but maybe you're getting some that have speech, OT, PT. Can you just speak? I was looking for, I think I've seen a graph just on the different costs of what that is to the CDCs. Is
Yes.
my question clear?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Scott and Senator Brennan. So frankly, for the child development centers, we have to have a free and appropriate education for children in their least restrictive environment. And so that means regardless if they have speech, OT, PT, or the gamut of services, we have to provide for them in a generalized education, which we don't get any funding for general education, but they have to be with their typically performing peers. And so, yes, while a kiddo may only need speech, we have to still provide them with their typically performing peers in a general education. And so that classroom alone for 15 students costs me about $100,000 a year, even though kiddos may only need speech, they may only need OT, PT, et cetera. It's that we have to follow all of the regulations, the rules and regulations under IDEA in order to provide for these children, which is the gamut. You know, I can't separate out for you what speech costs for one child or what PT costs for one child, because all of the services are built for that child. Does that make sense? Like, because of their IEP and their goals that we establish, they're specifically for that child, unfortunately. So, for example, I don't think that the districts could tell you how much one child that receives speech, how much that costs. Why? Because special education is 100% covered. So, and for us, it's not. Is all I can tell you is that I know how much my classroom costs to maintain, and I know how much services we have to provide for a child who has severe special needs compared to a child who only gets speech.
Did you have?
Sure.
Yeah, let me,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
that was, I think you touched on that last part that I was trying to kind of get at, was the difference between a child who needs like one service versus the cost of like a child that needs 3 or 4 different services, that there's like a difference in
Yes.
that cost, and that is what we're looking here at the funding model, more for funding just that child that needs like one service versus somebody who needs services from several different. Does that make it more clear?
Yeah, and it is, yes, thank you, Senator Brennan. It is, I mean, across the board, right? Because we don't just go in and provide speech. You know, we go in and give this child preschool and transportation and a facility to come to. And so it's so much more than that one service, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wondered, so I noticed that your funding, it really doesn't include the vehicle purchases, maintenance, buildings, all of that. So if you were to receive the 12,000 you're talking about per child, do you believe that would cover that? And is this, question 1, and then question 2, is this the first time that you've looked at it like an ECA, that the school districts received to include that, or was that included in the past?
Chairman Scott, thank you, Senator Steinmetz. So yes, I do believe the $12,000 would help to be all encompassing in covering not only the early childhood intervention, but also the facilities, the busing, the mileage reimbursement for parents, et cetera. In looking at our costs across the board, we, as CDCs, we felt as though getting us up to the $12,000 would be sufficient. Okay, now, can you tell me your second question about the ECA with school districts?
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Yes, I just wondered if in the past, what components were included in your ECA request? Was it because they said they tweaked it this time to be more like the K-12 system? So, and maybe that's a question for staff, which components were left out in the last round? I apologize for not getting that written down. Thank you.
And I think that would be a better question for the Department of Health in the request for the ECA. But I know.
Mr. Chairman, I can, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinmetz, just to kind of recap what the charge of the Department of Health is. They're required by statute to request any ECAs that are enacted by the legislature to this per pupil amount or per student amount as part of their budget request. They don't have a choice. They're required to do that. And so what they have done since that amount was established in statute, they come to the legislature, they ask for that inflated amount as required by statute. The request at the last meeting was for LSO to arrive at a cumulative adjusted amount since that base amount was arrived at. We took a different methodology than the Department of Health with the advice of the chairman to use a weighted average approach rather than just a strict educational materials that has been historically requested by the Department of Health. It's certainly a policy question whether or not you still want to charge the Department of Health to request that on an annual basis on whatever the legislature enacts for K-12 education, or if you want to tie it to a separate index. You know, the K-12 funding model doesn't adjust amounts for health insurance by an ECA. That's a separate calculation. We don't adjust special education, transportation, those are reimbursed. So these are all policy choices on whether or not you want to continue to charge the Department of Health to request these ECAs or not. So that's the context of it.
Potentially, we'll need new legislation to implement that, and that may be the vehicle for making permanent changes in the funding formula. And maybe the best thing to concentrate on this time is getting the amount right and change the formula in a systematic way with working with the preschool DD programs in changing the formula. Because it sounds like the current system is not fully rational. Representative Berger.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. So changing the ADM count and how you go about back to what you originally did, would that help with the new funding model and kind of give us a better picture of how we need to fund these CDCs or child development centers?
Probably potentially help them all. I think maybe a potential strategy is to make that change, have a careful look then at what its implications really were. But if we make that change here, it'll be a germane feature of the bill. If we don't, then you'll have an argument that you're expanding the title too much if you try to do it in session. So that might militate in favor of us doing that here. Senator Ruffus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the point of the 2 times a year calculation, one of the challenges there is that the 2 times that we would probably have to use if we're doing a forward projecting budget would be December of this year and May of this year, so both looking backwards and then averaging those. I don't know that helps. It wouldn't help if you were in an expanding situation where your facility were increasing. We struggle to do things where we use this December and next May unless that was used as the following years, and then we look back. It's almost always a look back. We do that with school districts, obviously, also, where we get an estimate, and then we end up in the next year making it right, but at that point, they've already wanted the money, and then we're lagging behind. So I'm struggling to come up with a way to implement that request in the way that helps you as you're intending. But I'll just ask, would an average of December 1 this year and May 1 this year, so the previous May, be better or worse for you? And I'd like to know if that is better or worse for others as well.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Senator Rothfuss, and who's joined me here is Aaron Stillwell from Stride Learning Center as well, and I'd be curious to hear what Aaron has to say on that. For us, we do pick up about a total of 60 children between December 1st and May 1st without any funding, and so until the following December 1st, if they're still on our count. So I feel, though, as averaging the 2, would benefit us, and I've heard from other centers that it would benefit them as well.
Okay, but you've got to understand that it depends how we word it.
Right.
If we do it the same way as the schools would, you're talking about May 1st of 2023, not May 1st of 2024.
Right.
And that would make, and doing it 24, there may be some administrative problems there. So you got to be careful which May 1st you're talking about. Okay, unless there are any further questions for Casper, I may have something for you, so stick handy. Let's hear from Stride.
Good morning, Senator or Chairman Scott and co-chairman and committee members. Thank you for letting me join a little bit mid-conversation with Alicia. Part of what I wanted to bring to your knowledge is that Stride does have a breakdown of all of the costs individually of maybe a student who is just receiving special education services independently versus a student who might be receiving just speech language services and PT. So we have a different breakdown that we would be happy to share with all of you that might help represent a little bit more of some of that information that you might be looking for. So we're certainly happy to share that with you. I would also like to share a little bit more with what Alicia was sharing in regards to maybe looking at the December 1 count independently right now. Just for an example, last December, so December 1 of 2022, we had on our December 1 count day, we had 206 children that were on that day eligible for special education and that Stride was providing services for. This December, it's not here yet, but with our current numbers that we already have, and we continue to complete a comprehensive evaluation on about 25 students per month, who then are often eligible for special education. But currently, right now, before we're even to our December 1 count for this year, Stride is already at 248 students. So between last December and this upcoming December, we've increased our students by at least 42, with the anticipation that more will be coming onto our count by December 1. So when we only have funding for that December 1 each year, there's a large group of students that we end up providing services for the rest of the year that weren't counted on that December 1 count. I'm happy to stop and answer questions about that if that would be helpful.
It makes sense that you've grown from last December, and under this legislation, it wouldn't, we would go on the December for that year. What does adding May bring to that average? Do you have more students in May than you typically do in December, and that's the issue? So would it then be, if we have to have a time back or looking backwards, does May 1st make more of a difference? Is that the time frame that would be better for schools and better representative of the full average of the year?
We do. Thank you for that question. Child development centers throughout our state receive referrals throughout the entire year. So from doctor's offices, from our Part C program, from parents who would like a comprehensive evaluation. So typically our two regions, Natrona and our county here, are typically the regions that provide or have the biggest numbers in terms of students on IEPs, evaluations that we do. So typically, on average, Stride provides or offers comprehensive evaluations to about 25 students per month during the school year. During that time, then that happens all year long. And so we typically have timelines that we are required to meet in regards to a comprehensive evaluation, meeting with the family and reviewing all of that information, and then answering questions towards eligibility. If a student is eligible for special education, we all together as a team develop something called an IEP, an individualized education program. So those kiddos are referred to us through a variety of means each month throughout the entire year. So on average, 25 a month. By December, we're going to have all of our kiddos that maybe were referred in September and October and November, and we're still in the evaluation process. By December 1, we've maybe finished evaluating all of those kiddos, but then in January and February and March and April and May, we still have kiddos that are coming to us that are being evaluated during that time. And so by May, we have much higher numbers than we will in December.
in the K-12 system, we fund according to what the formula says and adjust appropriations accordingly. As I understand it, in health department or LSO, correct me if I'm wrong, you get a single line item that uses the December count, can use the December count to compute what the line item will be. But once you've got that fixed line item, that's all the money there is. And if we put a May count in, we may reallocate amongst the centers, but we won't get you any more money in total. Is that correct? I'm looking, Mr. Will, I'm looking for the health department. Am I understanding what we've got here correctly?
Mr. Chairman, I think the budget is certainly constrained by what the legislature appropriates, but it would be part of it would not be, maybe Mr. Petrie can correct me. I don't believe this, I think the student count does come as an exception request as well. So the legislature has two types of exception requests that comes from the Department of Health. The first one is the ECA that we're discussing, but also the student count. And so they have two budget requests that increase their budget for those two purposes.
Use an May date, that will impact the exception request for the next year, but it won't immediately impact the funding. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And they, again, Mr. Petrie can correct me, the December 1st of this year will be presented to the Joint Appropriations Committee for the contracts the following year. And so there is a delay already built in to the adjustment for the student counts.
Mr. Chairman, clarification on that contract for the following year would begin when? When does that?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it's July 1st.
Is it a July 1 contract?
And so even if you do the May 1st average, that won't be known to the legislature. And so I think Senator Roth is right. If you want to have an accurate picture, you're going to have to take it from two separate school years or service years that the providers have in order to know what that student count is. Because for K-12 education, we know what that student count is based upon the data report of the Department of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, because I was just trying to figure that out myself. If we needed like a rolling average like we do in other areas, or just exactly how that would work. And this is very complicated for the last bill, if we really want to tackle this. So I think anything we do today will probably be a Band-Aid just to get you guys through. And then we do have a lot of big discussions to have if we really want to tackle this. So
This sounds like an
it does.
issue in your office.
Thank you. Just to understand the dynamic a little bit, it sounds like, which is different from how our schools work, it sounds like the enrollment number for the CDCs is an always increasing number beginning at the first day of school until the last day. It is a steady increase, and then it resets again, and then it goes back up based on the nature of how enrollment takes place on an ongoing basis. Okay, that's very different from schools, obviously, where we typically start at a high number, maybe it goes up a little tiny bit, and then it decays a little bit over the year. So, Mr. Chairman, with that in mind, there's a couple of things we can do. We can average the May 1st, and if that's the high point, December 1st is relatively the low point, the average of those two will be roughly equal to the average daily membership. The alternative would be to say that we would calculate on December 1st an average daily membership over the entire previous calendar year, which then gets you a daily average membership for the prior year. Slightly more complicated, but not a hell of a lot more complicated in terms of the workload. And then the final possibility, May 1st of the prior year would be a high point, which honestly sounds better than December 1st. If you were to just pick one date as your snapshot, just putting in May 1st as a snapshot is probably reasonable as well. I think those are the three possibilities that aren't Herculean for us to contemplate.
And I do think if we're going to redo the whole funding formula, that needs to be part of it. Health Department want to add something here?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would agree with nearly everything that Senator Rothfuss has said. A little history on the child count being done on December 1st. I don't know when it changed, but at one point it was November 1st, which was a bit more manageable in terms of budget preparation because we could get it into our actual budget request. You have inevitably seen every year a governor's letter coming from the governor's office, basically supporting the Department of Health, where we now know those December 1 counts, and we're saying, okay, here's our actual number. We didn't know it when we put our budget request together. And so we're already backpedaling to some degree with our exception requests. Mr. Wilmarth is also correct in that each year, statutorily, we're required to bring two exception requests, one for that external cost adjustment, and then one for an increase in the child account, assuming there is an increase in the child count. So I think that at one point, I think the rationale was, well, let's not take a once a year snapshot on November 1st. Let's take it on December 1st because that is the closest date to the budget session or the general session for that matter. And so we're working with the most accurate numbers we have. What we see, because we don't just count children on December 1st, we count them every month. What you see is that you do see what Mrs. Roan described earlier is that, and what Senator Rothfuss indicated is that May is probably more representative of the true population of children being served. Is December 1 a good indicator as well? Absolutely. Do the two basically mediate each other to some degree? I would say yes, but I think that in fairness, I think that counts in May certainly would add some information, add some content to the request. And the only other thing I might mention is that we would, if we used May, whether we used it individually or we used it in combination with December 1st, we would always have to look back to the preceding May, because otherwise we'd be projecting a child count 2 months beyond the end of the legislative session, which obviously is impossible.
Committee, if it's all right, I think what we need to do here is concentrate on the adequacy of the total number that is needed to get through this next year or two. And the change in the date looks to be complicated and something that ought to be done as part of redoing the whole funding system and some of the irrationality that seemed to have crept into it. So if it's all right, let's proceed on that basis, that's what we're trying. Senator Ralphus, do you have a problem with that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I do. Because over the years, I've definitely had a lot of conversations that went along the lines of, we should totally overhaul this and then we'll fix it all at once. And that list remains a very long list of incomplete challenges. It's certainly within the purview of this bill to do something as simple as change the word December to May. It is not a perfect solution, but it's just as easy to calculate May. In fact, it's easier because at that point, they've already got the budget information. The calculation has been done for a long time, and I think it makes the budget easier. So I don't see why we wouldn't just include that in this bill draft. Yeah, exactly. One way or another, that'll get it on the table. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Okay, anybody else here want to testify on this bill? Anybody else? Anybody that wants to testify, come forward and fill the thing up. Let's get this moving. Yes, sir. And then we'll go to you, and then we'll go to you.
Hello, Mr. Chairman, co-chairman, and committee. My name is Andrew Lozo, and I have a 3-year-old daughter that is disabled. She was born deaf and born with wasn't able to eat. She had a feeding tube. Stride came in at her 6 or 7 month mark, and I can't even put into words what they did for us. We had PT and OT come to our house, plus a speech therapist, and got her to eat, got the feeding tube removed. Janine here is her sign language teacher, and she's learned a bunch of sign language. We would be lost without Stride. That's all I really wanted to say. Thank you.
Good morning, Senator Scott, Representative Northrup, and members of the JEC. My name is Taisha Hone, and I currently work at Stride Learning Center right here in Cheyenne. I'm a speech-language pathology assistant and have been involved with kids and education for the past 26 years. I am here today to ask for equitable funding for the Child Development Centers, CDCs, in Wyoming. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, was passed in 1975. The passage of IDEA meant children with disabilities could no longer be turned away from school and required that they have available to them a free, appropriate education, which emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs. Currently, in the state of Wyoming, a 5-year-old child getting special education services receives approximately half the funding a 6-year-old child receives due to the funding distribution in our state. How can this be, you ask? It is because a 6-year-old can no longer be served by a CDC, but rather by Wyoming's public school system, and funding provided to our public schools for this same child is double what a CDC gets. Again, I am here today to ask for equitable funding. A 5-year-old receiving services under the IDEA umbrella deserves the very same funding as a 6-year-old. The CDCs in the state of Wyoming provide special education and related services to many children who come from families of varied socioeconomic status. The CDCs are not a charity. Under IDEA, we are required to provide special education and related services to children with disabilities. We serve children who are on IEPs, individual education plans, wherever they attend preschool, and some of the CDCs also provide high-quality preschools. Like Representative Provenza said, research shows the return on investment for early childhood education suggests tremendous value, ranging from $4 to $13 for every dollar spent, from impacts on education attainment, employment, health, truancy, and criminality. It is a challenge to continue to provide high-quality services to all children who qualify to receive services under IDEA. In the past few years, I've had coworkers leave the CDC for better paying jobs with healthier benefits at the school district and elsewhere. Early childhood educators have low salaries, a lack of recognition and value, yet a demanding and immensely important career. Those of us who remain in the field are passionate about the kids and the families that we serve. We serve the best kids at the CDCs. I can tell you from firsthand experience that these 3, 4, and 5-year-olds are joyful, silly, funny, energetic, curious, precocious. And some of them come into this world with some real challenges. Let us help them. Let us help their families. It is the right thing to do for the state of Wyoming. In conclusion, a quote from Rita Pearson: "Every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists they become the best they can possibly be." Legislators, champion and support the preschoolers of Wyoming. Give them the equitable funding they so deserve. Be generous. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Kennedy Bernhardt, and I'm a mother of 2 wonderful autistic boys. We are an Air Force family, and we arrived at Cheyenne in 2019 after the Air Force deemed this base to be the most successful and the best in resources for my children. This is where our relationship with Stride began. Stride has made my 2 boys successful. Both of my boys were nonverbal before we suck services, and today my oldest is using full language, and my youngest uses sign language. I have Stride to thank a million times over for all that they have done for my family and their staff, their program, and their school environment has allowed my children to thrive. I can't say that for the school systems. My oldest son was allowed to fall through the cracks in his first year of kindergarten. He was allowed to elope a minimum of 5 times from the classroom. He was told there was no para for him and that he was the bully because of the way he was acting out. I had to be my son's advocate because no one looked out for him. I had to stay on top of the situation, and I had to use services such as PIC to ensure that my son was able to receive the education he deserves. My son is now homeschooled, and we face other hindrances, such as we've been on a waiting list for 8 weeks for outsourcing for speech therapy. Stride has always gone above and beyond and been there, and they offer those resources, including therapies, an outstanding classroom, and pace-setter students that help guide my children. Stride is a staple in this community for kids with disabilities and their families. Without Strides, others will fall through the cracks. My children and others might not have a voice, but I'm here today hoping that you approve this so that no one will have to face struggles and having to search for outsources. Thank you so much.
Sorry. Good morning. My name is Tanya Barcelona, and I'd like to start by thanking the committee for allowing us this opportunity to voice our concerns regarding funding for early childhood education, and more specifically, early childhood interventions. I am the parent of a preschooler on the autism spectrum. I'm also a former education and preschool teacher. So I have a unique perspective on the importance and need for students with disabilities to receive interventions as early as possible. Even as a former educator, when my own child began to show signs of speech delay and cognitive delay at age 2, I was kind of at a loss. I'd lived and worked in Colorado most of my life, and despite being aware of a lot of the programs and services offered there, I didn't know the first place to start here in Wyoming. Thankfully, a friend mentioned Stride and suggested I give them a call. I didn't know exactly what to expect, but they were so kind and understanding. They immediately set up a meeting with me and my child. I was nervous because I felt like I had this wealth of knowledge, but navigating a diagnosis for my own child felt so much more daunting. I felt heard and supported, so I can only imagine that a parent with no prior knowledge of disabilities, autism, or speech delays need that support even more than I did. We're all aware that under IDEA, children with an identifiable disability are required by law to receive services. And the reality is that the number of services children require has increased drastically, along with the number of students that need services. Right now, the funding for early intervention is almost half of what grade school children receive. If anything, they should be a higher amount given to early education, as research has shown that early intervention can lead to a decrease in the need of special education services as children get older. Rand Research Group studied short and long-term benefits from early intervention programs. They found that of the 19 programs they followed, they all demonstrated significant benefits in at least one or more of the following domains: cognition and academic achievement, behavioral and emotional competencies, educational progression and attainment, health, delinquency and crime, social welfare program use, and labor market success. In fact, they've determined that well-designed and funded early education programs have found to generate a return to society ranging from $1 to $17 for each dollar spent on the programs. Investing more money into early education, we're making an investment in our future, literally. We have an opportunity to impact the future of our state and our citizens. We can invest in children now, or we can end up using that money in the future to fund more social welfare programs, spend more in the criminal justice system, or more to support a population that can't take care of themselves. Let's be proactive. Let's start helping people early in their lives and education journey to ensure their and our future. We can grow future leaders and give them the support and the tools that they need for success now. Thank you.
I'll be next. Chairman Scott, Co-Chairman Northrup, and Joint Education Committee. I had a lot of things written here, and a lot of them have already been said. I do want to mention, thank you, Senator Rothfuss, with the May 1st. My name is Janine Cole. I'm a teacher of the deaf, and I'm also an early childhood special ed teacher at Stride. This is my retirement job. It's much harder than my job at the Wyoming Department of Education that I did for 35 years. But, and there at the Department of Ed, I worked as an outreach consultant for deaf and hard of hearing, and also as the supervisor for outreach programs. But basically what I wanted you to know about the December 1st count is I can think of 3 or 4 children that weren't identified until after the December 1st count, and they went to kindergarten in the next school year, so we never received any funding for those children. So I think that's an important thing that you need to know. Also, I'm nervous all of a sudden. I just want to leave you with 4 signs, all right? I want to leave you with support. I want to leave you with children, and I want to leave you with equal funding, because right now there is not equal funding for our children that are in child development centers. It's not the same as what we see in school districts. So, thank you. Done.
Good almost afternoon. My name is Lori Byrne. I'm a physical therapist at Stride. I work on the infant toddler side of things, the Part C side, and I've worked at Stride for 10 years. And again, I have a lot of things written down. Many of them have been said. We really appreciate your critical thinking about all of this today. It's very emotional. It requires an analytical, an accounting mind for it. And I think, we appreciate every day the funding that we have, and don't want to sound ungrateful and just continually asking for more. But the model that the state of Wyoming has chosen to provide early intervention is very expensive. And in order to provide it and continue to require the same things and even require more of us every year and not increase our funding accordingly, it's just, the math is impossible. So it becomes more emotional because then, it's just super frustrating for all of us that are really in the trenches, and we're driving around all day in the ice and in the heat, depending on the season. We're in daycares, being dogpiled by toddlers, visiting with babies. We're in homes, in very challenging home situations. We're managing families on the Part C side, because we are treating the baby and the family. And just, it's all just a lot. And this ECA is just so important for Stride and the other CDCs in Wyoming. And the other thing that I think has not been emphasized enough is just that over the last 10 years, the trend towards very involved kiddos has been, nobody knows what it is, right? So we certainly noticed things after COVID in terms of the kids that were home and isolated, and we certainly see all that. but just in terms of really severe high needs kids who are now being pushed out into the community preschools because we've had to close our inclusive classrooms. So now these community preschools who are already understaffed, the staff is underpaid, and they certainly didn't work there so that they could work with very involved kids from Stride. These kids are now in these environments, and we're trying to do a lot of damage control at Stride on our preschool side by having our therapists and our teachers and all the people that normally worked with these kids in our classrooms, in these inclusive classrooms. Now they're in these daycare environments, and it's not good. And if anybody wants to do a ride along with any of us ever, please give us a call, because you would see it's shocking what's not happening in the community preschools. And again, it's evolving, right? Because this is the first year we've had to really, really cut back our inclusive classrooms. So I think we're learning, and the community preschools are learning, but it's very inadequate right now. And it is really a funding issue. We had to sell a building this year. We cut employee benefits. People are leaving. It's all just this trickle-down effect now, and it's very budget-oriented. So we really appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay. Committee, we're going to work the bill next, get it done, but I'm going to make a request. It's one thing what this committee decides, but this is one the full legislature, all 93 members, is going to decide. And frankly, I'm going to need some more information. You don't have I don't know what extent there's a preschool organization here anymore. But Alicia, can you and the Stride people take the lead? I would like to see for at least your two organizations, the Teton County one, and a representative sample of the rest of them, balance sheet and most recent balance sheet and income statements. So we can, really, I'm going to look at them for signs of financial distress. And I may well rope in Representative Overmuller to give me a hand. We're the ones that have had some professional training in this group and how to deal with that sort of thing. So if we could get that, and it doesn't have to be next week, but it has to be reasonably soon so that we're well prepared, because we'll deal with that issue again.
Mr. Chairman.
In session.
Mr. Chairman, Tanya is bringing by a handout Stride provided not too long ago. So maybe that would be helpful as well.
Okay. So okay, but this is not a balance sheet or an income statement, and specifically, those are what we need. So, okay, committee, work the bill. Do I hear a motion on the bill? Second. Motion and second. Any amendments? Senator Office, did you have an amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Page 2, line 9, change the word December to May.
Second. Mr. Chairman, if I might, there are two other references in that statute to the December 1st date, but they're not drawn into this particular bill. So if you could give us allowance to make those conforming changes.
If the amendment does, you'll deal, LSO, you'll deal with that and modify the title, because we want to make sure the title reflects this.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just give us latitude to make conforming changes.
Okay. If the amendment passes, you've got the latitude. Yep. Okay. Committee, any discussion on this? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carried. Anything further? Any further amendments? Okay, Representative Obermuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On line 12, the number 10,115, change that to 12,300.
Okay. Moved and seconded. Explain what you're doing and why.
I'm responding to the testimony that we've heard today and the schedule on the back of the sheet that shows the recalculated number 12,290, just rounding that to 12,003. So those are the two pieces of my thinking.
Okay.
So we have two numbers that aggregate to provide the per child, where you've got what's on page 2, line 12, and then on 20 and 21 is an additional amount. We don't have the rest of the language below that for what that provides, but it's in statute, provides a list of what that's for. And I guess my question is, should our aggregate be the target number, where 12,000 is the intended target, which would mean potentially raising line 12 to more like 11.9, or is, I think the motion, which is 12.3 here, then assumed to add another 432 from below to be what is effectively 12,732.
Representative Obermuller, which are you trying to get?
I am not changing line 20. I'm leaving that as it is. We don't have the actual, what those numbers down below, that isn't actually described within this bill. It's offline. So maybe someone could speak to that as to the difference between those two numbers. But
Matt, can you enlighten us a little here?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just doing the math on this, the 8,503 that's being amended to the 10,115 and the $363 being amended to 432. The 630 or the 336 is approximately 4.1% of the total amount. The total amount under current law is $8,866. If you want to retain a 4.1% ratio, we can do that. If your total amount wants to be 12,300, we can take 4% of that amount and put that under subsection D on page 2. It's certainly a policy call, but that's what the current percentage is.
If this amendment passes, you can make that adjustment, and you'll have to adjust the total of the appropriation as well, right?
Mr. Chairman, that was my second question, is if you would allow the conforming amendment to the total appropriation.
Yes, I think the answer, Representative Obermuller, is yes, is it not?
And Mr. Chairman, just to give you an idea what that would be, it'd be approximately the total appropriation would move to $24,729,616 for the biennium. So approximately $12,350,000 for each year.
Okay, so that would give us a much higher going in number, which is supported by the public testimony. Is that what's going on? Okay. Everybody understand? Any further discussion? Okay. All those in favor of this amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carried. And this will put us in a different bargaining position, essentially, as we go forward. Anything further? Senator Steinmetz.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, if you.
Okay, hold Sherry a minute.
With the May 1st amendment, would you allow the flexibility also to adjust the $24 million appropriation to reflect the May 1st, or do you want that? Because right now.
When you look at the effective dates, the May 1st will have effect later on. I think we better leave the appropriation not adjusted for the May 1st date.
So, Mr. Chairman, just the 24 million is based upon the December 1st 2022 counts, and we left in the staff comment that those will change as of December 1st of 2023. And as I indicated, those are separate exception requests, the ECA and the counts. I guess what I'll leave you with is right now the $24.7 million is based upon the December 1st, 2022 counts. They don't reflect May counts, and I don't know if the department has May counts. But I'll just, when you.
The first May count will take May of 2024, the way the effective dates work, as I understand the bill.
Mr. Chair, we can certainly,
So the May thing takes effect in the future.
Mr. Chairman, I think what we'll have to do is make a separate section within the bill to direct the Department of Health as part of their exception request that the May 1st date is prospective. I think that's the intent.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's the effect of what we've done so far.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think so. Let's just say that that staff has flexibility to figure it out and do do what's appropriate to adjust the appropriation, because I think it will read that we will end up using the May 1st, 2023 number for this is a biennial appropriation. So yeah, they'll project based on that. So I think they would use that number. If you think otherwise, I say we leave it up to staff to figure it out.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, May 1st, 2023 counts won't be reported by the time you're in session. So I think how this will actually be carried out under the department, and maybe I'm pontificating here, but the legislature is basing its budget on known numbers. And what I anticipate is working with the Department of Health to, if they have the data, to know what May of 2022 is, or May of 2023. And that will be for the contracts effective for July 1, 2024.
What you want is a provision to be able to do that.
Mr. Chairman, what I'm asking for is flexibility to adjust the appropriation, not just for the $12,300, but also to reflect the May 1st, 2023 counts that would be utilized for the fiscal year 25 contracts.
Okay. Okay. Any problems? Okay. Anything further? Sherry.
All right, Mr. Chairman. To see if I can wrap us up, the only thing that I have a little heartburn about is the fact that we're putting this in the standard budget. And so if we're gonna come back and reevaluate all of this, I would prefer we get them through this time period, but not make it a part of the standard budget, so that we can really reevaluate what are the components, what kind of a stable funding stream are we going to provide, because if it gets baked into the standard budget, we may not see the true costs of what we're dealing with. So that would be my only thing, and if we were to take that as an amendment, it would be on bottom of page 3, line 21, after the year 2026, delete the rest of that line in 21 and 22, and then the rest of the verbiage on page 4 there, on line 1 through 2. So I would feel a lot more comfortable with that, just because, so that we know what we're dealing with, and we come back and really take a hard look at this of how we're going to move forward in the future. So if I had a second, that was my motion.
Okay, so we're deleting that sentence that starts on page 3, line 21, where it is and proceeds to.
Mr. Chairman, may I offer some clarification on this? I think on page 3, line 16, it would read, this appropriation shall not be, not be part of the standard budget.
I think,
Or sorry, Mr. Chairman, I think it's on the bottom of page 3, sorry, I apologize. It is the intent of legislature that this appropriation not be included in the standard budget of the Department of Health for new lease.
that's going a little further than she's going, which is just to delete the standard budget provisions. I think that might be safer going.
All right, that would be a friendly
going with your
amendment.
original one.
Yeah, that would be a friendly,
Okay, do you want what Matt's suggesting, or do you want?
just
to
say
make-
it shall not be. Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and maybe Mr. Petrie can speak to, there are some maintenance of effort issues and, not making this part of the standard budget request. And then also in subsection E on page 3, the request of the charge of the department is to not only request the ECAs enacted by the legislature, but then do you want them to request this amount as an exception request as well? There's some maintenance of effort issues, I think, that come into play.
Petrie.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think really what we're looking at here is the exception request that the Department of Health has on the books right now for consideration in the next session is what it is. We're still bound by existing statute to bring it forward using that one cost index. If this bill were to pass, those two amounts are mutually exclusive. If this bill were to pass, and including the discussion we just had with a $24 million add, it would effectively eliminate our exception request. If this bill did not pass, our exception request then would obviously receive its full consideration through the legislature. So I think that's an important consideration. The other thing that I think is important here is that changing the May 1 date, we've discussed that would be something that we would implement proactively in the future. But I think really what you have here is you're resetting that minimum dollar amount per child, that minimum funding amount per child. And then you're implementing a new strategy for calculating external cost adjustments going into the future using 4 indices instead of just one, and using a May 1 date for the child count rather than December 1st. So that's essentially what we've discussed up to this point. As it stands now, when there is an appropriation either for external cost adjustment or an increase in the child count, it does affect the standard budget for this program. Now, it can, by the methodology itself, can change that. If you have a decrease in the child count, obviously that can have an impact on the appropriation. If a future external cost adjustment is not appropriated, obviously that too can have an effect. But to get to the question that was raised about maintenance of effort, if we do not make these additions a part of the standard budget, then you're practically guaranteeing a maintenance of effort non-compliance issue. Because year after year, we have to maintain the same level of state funding that we had the previous year. So a one-time infusion of cash, if you will, to the program resets that bar. It resets that maintenance of effort bar. And then if that one-time funding is not repeated in the subsequent year or the subsequent biennium, you have practically guaranteed a maintenance of effort compliance issue. Including it as part of the standard budget does not differ from how we have done this in the past. But what you have is you have changes to the standard budget that are then addressed on an annual basis through the statute in terms of external cost adjustments. Of course, budget cuts can come into factor as well, and also changes in the child count.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that good information. And I think that's why we've been so hesitant to approve an entire ECA in the past. So is there a way to give a one-time cash infusion to get you by and then readjust all of this? Because the maintenance of effort component of this is, it is the elephant in the room, right? Because once we raise that money, that standard, then we have to meet it forever into the future. There's no decreasing that unless it's through child count. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, yes, that is correct. There are some very restricted reasons that you can reduce the state portion that drives that maintenance of effort calculation, but they are, as I said, they're pretty restricted. I mean, they really do not come into play. And so, yes, if you give a one-time appropriation, it will reset that maintenance of effort bar. The federal government will expect us to continue funding at that level. If the appropriation comes to us in fiscal year 25, it will expect us to maintain that same level of funding for FY 26 unless there's a decrease in the child count, and then that could ratchet it down.
Okay, thank you for that. I would withdraw my motion.
Anything further? Anything further? Okay, call the roll on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, for 24 LSO-0201, developmental preschool funding as amended, Senator Beitman?
No.
Senator Brennan?
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss?
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz?
No.
Representative Allred?
Aye.
Representative Andrew?
No.
Representative Berger?
Aye.
Representative Brown has left an absentee vote of aye. Representative Klauston?
Aye.
Representative Lawley?
Aye.
Representative Overmueller?
Aye.
Representative Provenza?
Aye.
Co-Chairman Northrup?
Aye.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 11 ayes and 3 noes.
Okay. With that, we're going to adjourn for lunch. I understand the charter school people are fighting. Is that correct? Where?
Mr. Chairman, it's in the Student Learning Center in the extension, so towards the auditorium.
Okay, so we'll come back in an hour then at 1:30. A little more than an hour. Okay.